There is a moment, just before dawn, when the Nile Valley seems to belong to no one. The darkness is still gathered over the river, and the mud brick houses along its banks are little more than soft shapes against the night, their walls absorbing the faintest suggestion of light from the eastern horizon, while somewhere beyond the sleeping houses the water moves slowly past, carrying reeds, reflected stars, and the coolness of the hours before the sun returns. You are awake. Not because an alarm has sounded. There is no electric clock waiting beside you, no glowing rectangle to tell you what hour it is, and no mechanical voice reminding you that morning has arrived. Instead, you wake because the world around you is beginning to move. A faint sound comes from somewhere beyond the room. Perhaps a vessel being shifted across a floor. Perhaps the quiet scrape of a door. Perhaps a donkey stirring outside. Perhaps the first bird calling from the riverbank. And for a moment, lying in the darkness, you might think that ancient Egypt is peaceful. You would be right. But only partly. Because the peacefulness of this world is not the peacefulness of a modern bedroom, where silence is created by walls, electricity, insulation, and the invisible machinery of a modern city. This is a different kind of quiet. It is a living quiet. A quiet filled with animals, water, insects, wind, human breathing, and the distant sounds of people beginning another day. And if you had somehow arrived here without preparation, you would already be discovering one of the first things that makes ancient Egypt difficult. The world does not wait for you. The sun will rise whether you are ready or not. The river will continue flowing whether you understand it or not. The fields will need attention. The animals will need feeding. The grain will need grinding. The water will need carrying. The household will need preparing. And somewhere, in the growing darkness, someone has already been awake longer than you. For many Egyptians, the ordinary day began long before anything that we might recognize as a morning routine. There was no universal schedule, of course. Farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, officials, servants, priests, sailors, children, and members of wealthy households lived according to different rhythms. Ancient Egypt was not one experience. It was many thousands of experiences layered across a narrow ribbon of fertile land. But the river connected them, and the rising sun connected them. The same light that eventually illuminated the temples also fell across the smallest mud brick houses. The same Nile that carried royal boats also carried fishermen, farmers, merchants, baskets of grain, jars of beer, and people simply trying to get somewhere. This is the Egypt we are going to visit tonight. Not the Egypt of postcards. Not the Egypt of enormous pyramids rising dramatically against an empty desert. Not the Egypt of golden masks and royal processions. Those things existed. But they were only one small part of the world. Most people woke up somewhere much more ordinary. A house. A courtyard. A village. A farm. A boat. A workshop. A room with walls made from earth and straw. And as the first faint light approaches, the modern traveler begins to notice another problem. The floor is hard. The air is already warm. There is no soft mattress in the modern sense. There is no climate control. There is no glass window keeping the outside world at a comfortable distance. There is no tap from which cool water appears. There is only the house, the family, the objects inside it, and the world beyond the doorway. In some Egyptian houses, sleeping could take place on raised surfaces or mats, and roofs could also become useful living spaces, particularly in a climate where evenings might be more comfortable than enclosed interiors. Archaeological remains from settlements such as Akhetaten and Deir el-Medina show how domestic spaces could be arranged around central rooms, courtyards, work areas, and other practical spaces rather than resembling modern private bedrooms. The house itself is already teaching you something. Ancient people did not necessarily experience their homes as we do. A modern house often separates activities into specialized rooms. Kitchen, bedroom, bathroom, living room, office, storage. The ancient Egyptian house could be more fluid. Work, cooking, storage, eating, sleeping, socializing, and household tasks could overlap. The boundaries between activities were not always the boundaries you would expect. And perhaps that is the first comforting thing to understand. You are not looking at a failed version of a modern house. You are looking at a successful house designed for a different world. Its walls do not need to contain electricity. Its rooms do not need to accommodate appliances. Its architecture does not need to make room for plumbing networks, cars, computers, refrigeration, or central heating. It needs shade. It needs storage. It needs somewhere to prepare food. It needs somewhere to sleep. It needs somewhere for a family to gather. And above all, it needs to make life possible in the climate of the Nile Valley. The walls are part of that solution. Mud brick is not glamorous. It does not shine like limestone. It does not survive in the imagination as easily as a temple column. But mud brick was one of the great materials of ordinary Egyptian life. Earth, water, plant material, labor, and time could become walls. The material belonged to the landscape itself. And that matters because ancient Egypt was a civilization of extraordinary contrasts. The temples could be monumental. The tombs could be painted. Royal objects could be covered in gold. But much of ordinary life depended on things that were simple, local, repetitive, and practical. Mud, reed, wood, linen, clay, stone, grain, water, and human hands. Always human hands. That is another reason you would struggle here. Your modern body is accustomed to a world where machines quietly perform thousands of tasks. A pump moves water. A refrigerator preserves food. A washing machine cleans clothing. A truck carries grain. A stove heats food. A light bulb extends the day. A phone carries a message across the world. Ancient Egypt has none of these invisible conveniences. Instead, the work is visible. If water needs to move, someone moves it. If grain needs to become flour, someone grinds it. If food needs to be cooked, someone prepares the fire. If clothing needs to be cleaned, someone washes it. If goods need to travel, someone carries them or loads them onto an animal or boat. The civilization is magnificent, but underneath the magnificence is labor. An enormous amount of labor. And you have probably never noticed how much modern life hides from you. Imagine, for a moment, that you have become thirsty. You sit up. You look around. There is no plastic bottle waiting beside the bed. There is no refrigerator humming quietly in the next room. There is no faucet. There may be a vessel containing water, but that water had to come from somewhere. Perhaps it was drawn from a well. Perhaps it was brought from the river. Perhaps another person carried it. At communities such as Deir el-Medina, communal wells and designated water carriers helped supply households because the settlement itself was separated from the Nile. The British Museum records how transporting water and other supplies could become a significant practical burden. For a modern person, water is often an invisible background condition. In ancient Egypt, water was never quite invisible. It shaped geography. It shaped settlement. It shaped agriculture. It shaped work. It shaped transportation. And it shaped thought. The Nile was not simply somewhere you went. The Nile was part of the structure of existence. You could build your life beside it. You could travel on it. You could fish in it. You could draw water from it. You could irrigate fields through systems connected to it. You could watch the seasons through its changing level. You could watch boats arriving with goods from distant places. And you could stand beside it at night and hear the water moving through darkness. For a listener trying to fall asleep, there is something almost strange about imagining that sound. The river does not care what century it is. Water moves. Reeds move. Wind passes over the surface. Birds call. And somewhere on the bank, an Egyptian household is beginning another day. You rise. You step toward the doorway. The darkness outside is gradually becoming gray. The first thing you notice is the air. It is cooler than it will be later. This is one of the small gifts of the Egyptian morning. The day has not yet become oppressive. The sun has not yet climbed high above the fields. The ground still holds some of the coolness of night. And so the early hours are valuable. Work can begin before the strongest heat. Travel can begin. Animals can be tended. Fields can be inspected. Bread can be prepared. Water can be carried. The day has a natural rhythm. Morning belongs to activity. Afternoon may become slower. Evening brings another transition. Night brings darkness. And darkness is important because ancient people lived much more closely with it than you do. When the sun disappeared, the world did not remain brightly illuminated. There were lamps. There was firelight. There was moonlight. There were stars. But there was no permanent artificial glow washing over the streets. The darkness was real. You could see it. You could feel it. You could hear how far away a sound was. A lamp could illuminate a small area, but beyond its reach the world quickly became shadow. The Metropolitan Museum's research on Egyptian domestic life describes lamps as commonly consisting of small vessels or saucer-like forms holding oil and a wick. That means light itself had a physical cost. Oil. Fuel. Maintenance. Attention. A lamp was not simply switched on. Someone had to prepare it. Someone had to provide the fuel. Someone had to light it. And eventually someone had to extinguish it. This changed the character of night. Modern cities pushed darkness away. Ancient Egypt accepted it. And when darkness is accepted, bedtime becomes less like a scheduled appointment and more like a gradual surrender to the environment. The house grows quieter. The lamp burns lower. The voices soften. The animals settle. The river continues. And eventually, people sleep. But for now, the sun is rising. You step outside. And this is where your first real mistake becomes obvious. You have dressed for comfort. The ancient Egyptian has dressed for the world. That difference matters. Linen was one of the defining materials of Egyptian clothing, and surviving evidence shows the importance of textiles to daily life. Wealth, status, occupation, and context could all influence clothing, while simpler garments were practical responses to the climate. Your modern clothing may feel familiar, but familiar is not necessarily useful. You are carrying assumptions about pockets, fasteners, fabrics, shoes, layering, and movement. The Egyptian household is working with a different vocabulary. Linen. Belts. Simple garments. Bare feet in many ordinary situations. Sandals when appropriate. Clothing that can be washed. Clothing that can be repaired. Clothing that belongs to a household economy where textiles are valuable. You begin to realize that even getting dressed is part of a much larger system. Nothing is disposable. Not the cloth. Not the vessel. Not the basket. Not the food. Not the fuel. Not the tools. Objects have lives. A pot can be repaired. A garment can be washed. A basket can be reused. A piece of stone can become a writing surface. At Deir el-Medina and elsewhere, everyday records survived on ostraca, fragments of limestone or pottery used for writing. demonstrating how ordinary administration and communication could rely on materials very different from modern paper and screens. You leave the house. The street is beginning to wake. There is no traffic, but there is movement. A person carrying something. Another person leading an animal. A child near a doorway. A worker preparing tools. Someone calling to someone else. A vessel being lifted. A door opening. A bird crossing the pale sky. And beneath all of this, the first warmth of the sun. You have been awake for perhaps an hour. Already, you are tired. Not because anything dramatic has happened. Nothing has chased you. No army has appeared. No mummy has emerged from a tomb. There is no curse. There is only the beginning of a normal day. And that is the point. The ancient world does not need to be spectacular to be difficult. It only needs to remove the things you have stopped noticing. You are thirsty. You are hungry. You need to wash. You need to find food. You need to understand where you are allowed to go. You need to understand who you are speaking to. You need to know how to move through the settlement. You need to know how to work. You need to know when to rest. You need to know where the river is. You need to know what the river is doing. And perhaps most importantly, you need to know your place. Ancient Egyptian society was highly structured. Your occupation mattered. Your family mattered. Your relationship to institutions mattered. Your access to resources mattered. Your social position mattered. The difference between an official's household and a laborer's household was enormous. The difference between an elite tomb and a simple burial could be enormous. The British Museum emphasizes that much of what survives from wealthy Egyptians comes from tombs precisely because burial preserved objects that would otherwise have disappeared, meaning the archaeological record is weighted toward people who could afford such things. So when you look at the beautiful paintings of ancient Egypt, you must remember something. They are windows. But they are not transparent windows. They show us something. They also hide something. They were created for particular people in particular contexts with particular purposes. A painted field is not necessarily a photograph of a field. A banquet scene is not necessarily an ordinary Tuesday. A tomb painting may show an idealized world designed to ensure prosperity in the afterlife. And yet, despite these limitations, fragments of ordinary life survive. A bowl. A tool. A worker's attendance record. A legal complaint. A house. A cooking vessel. A child's object. A piece of writing. A worn staircase. A water source. A bread loaf. These small things can sometimes tell us more about a vanished world than a statue of a king, because they are close to the human hand. And tonight, we are going to stay close to the human hand. The hand that grinds grain. The hand that pulls a rope. The hand that lifts a jar. The hand that writes a name. The hand that touches a wall warmed by the sun. The hand that reaches into a basket for bread. The hand that lowers a lamp wick as evening arrives. That is where ancient Egypt becomes real, not in the gold. In the ordinary. The sun has now risen. The darkness is gone. The Nile has become a long ribbon of reflected light. And the day is beginning in earnest. Somewhere nearby, grain is being prepared. And if you are going to survive even the first part of this day, you are going to have to eat. That sounds easy. It is not. Because breakfast is about to become work. Before we follow the smell of bread, we need to follow the water. The Nile is still beside us. The morning light has spread across the river, turning its surface pale gold where the sun reaches it and leaving deeper shadows beneath the reeds. A boat moves slowly across the water. Its shape is simple from this distance. Wood. Rope. Cloth. Human effort. And the boat is carrying something. Perhaps people. Perhaps grain. Perhaps goods. Perhaps nothing more remarkable than a few people traveling to the next settlement. But the important thing is that the river makes the journey possible. Ancient Egypt was not built beside the Nile by accident. The river created the conditions in which dense settlement and agriculture could flourish in an otherwise arid landscape. The fertile alluvial lands along the Nile were where people cultivated crops, raised animals, established villages, and built cities. The annual inundation renewed those lands, while variations in the flood could bring either abundance or hardship. This means that if you want to understand why an ancient Egyptian could live here, you must first understand something about water. Not just drinking water, living water, agricultural water, traveling water, seasonal water, sacred water. Water as the beginning of food. Because somewhere beyond this morning scene, the river is already deciding what the future will look like. The farmer cannot command the Nile. The fisherman cannot command it. The boatman cannot command it. Even the state, for all its power, exists within the rhythms of the river. The flood arrives. The flood recedes. The soil is exposed. The fields are planted. Crops grow. Harvest arrives. Then the cycle begins again. This rhythm was so fundamental that Egyptian culture developed a calendar structured around the agricultural year. And here you encounter another reason a modern person might not last a day. You have grown accustomed to thinking of nature as scenery. Ancient Egyptians could not afford that luxury. The landscape was infrastructure. The river was infrastructure. The seasons were infrastructure. The sky was infrastructure. The soil was infrastructure. A change in any of these could become a practical problem. Imagine waking before dawn and wondering not whether your phone is charged, but whether the river has behaved as expected. Imagine looking across a field and understanding that your family's food depends on what happened upstream months earlier. Imagine that the wealth of your household is tied to grain, and grain is tied to soil, and soil is tied to water, and water is tied to a river whose yearly behavior you cannot fully control. That is a different relationship with nature. It is intimate, and sometimes frightening, but it is also beautiful. The Nile at sunrise is difficult to describe without becoming poetic. The water catches the first light. The palms stand dark against the sky. Birds move between the reeds. A boat glides past. The desert begins where the fertile land ends. And between those two worlds lies Egypt, green and brown, water and sand, life and emptiness. A narrow ribbon of abundance running through a vast landscape. The Egyptians knew this contrast intimately. The cultivated valley was precious precisely because the desert was so close. And that desert was not simply an empty wasteland. It provided stone, minerals, routes, quarries, burial grounds, space for temples and tombs. But ordinary life clustered around the river. The closer you move toward the water, the more you encounter movement. People, animals, boats, crops, reeds, noise. The further you move into the desert, the more the world opens and empties. That contrast will remain with us throughout this story. Because ancient Egypt was a civilization that learned how to live between extremes. Flood and drought, sun and shade, river and desert, abundance and uncertainty, monument and mud brick, king and farmer, life and death. And beneath all of them is the same river. You look at it again. It seems peaceful. It is peaceful. But it is also powerful. It has been moving for longer than any Egyptian alive this morning can remember, and the people around you have learned to live with it. They know where the water is. They know where the land is firm. They know where boats can pass. They know where fish gather. They know when fields should be planted. They know how to move through this landscape. You do not. That is why you would not last a day. Not because you are weak, because you are inexperienced. You have arrived in a world that requires thousands of tiny pieces of knowledge. Knowledge that has been accumulated through generations. Knowledge that does not always need to be written down. Knowledge that lives in hands, in habits, in memory, in the shape of a village, in the location of a well, in the angle of a roof, in the position of a field, in the timing of a boat. And as the sun climbs higher, the people around you begin to move faster. The morning is becoming warm. Soon it will be hotter. The river remains beside you. The fields wait. The houses wait. The work waits. And somewhere nearby, someone is grinding grain. The sound is soft, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. Stone against grain. Stone against grain. Stone against grain. It is the sound of breakfast, and it is also the sound of labor. The two are about to become impossible to separate. The first thing you learn about food in ancient Egypt is that food does not simply appear. There is no refrigerator, no supermarket, no sealed packet, no delivery cart, no machine waiting to grind your flour. There is grain, and there are hands. In an Egyptian household, grain could be transformed through a long chain of human activity before it became something you could eat. Grinding, mixing, shaping, heating, waiting, and perhaps fermenting. Bread and beer were deeply important components of Egyptian food culture, and surviving archaeological evidence, models, tomb scenes, and actual food remains help reconstruct the processes involved in their preparation. A Middle Kingdom model in the Metropolitan Museum, for example, depicts women grinding grain while other workers prepare bread and beer aboard a boat used for a nobleman's outing. You watch the grinding stone move, back and forth, back and forth. The movement is repetitive. It is not dramatic. That is precisely why it is so important. Civilizations are often remembered for the things that happen once. A king is crowned. A battle is fought. A temple is built. A tomb is sealed. But civilization continues because someone performs the same task every morning. Grinding, sweeping, carrying, cooking, weaving, repairing, cleaning, planting, harvesting, feeding. The great monuments are extraordinary. The repetition beneath them is even more extraordinary. Because without repetition, there is no civilization. You reach toward the grain. It feels ordinary, small, dry, almost insignificant. Yet this handful of grain represents fields, farmers, soil, water, weather, storage, transport, administration, labor, and time. The grain has traveled through an entire system, and now it is becoming breakfast. Bread was not necessarily the same in every household. Neither was beer. Neither were vegetables, fish, meat, fruit, or dairy products. Food depended on geography, wealth, occupation, season, and availability. The wealthy could enjoy a wider range of foods. Ordinary households depended more heavily on staple foods. This is one of the themes that will keep returning. Ancient Egypt was not one kitchen. It was thousands of kitchens, some wealthy, some modest, some crowded, some comfortable, some struggling, some attached to large estates, some tucked into narrow village streets, some near the river, some far enough away that water and supplies had to be carried. The household is where the great history becomes personal. A field is an economic resource, but a field is also where someone's family works. A grain store is an administrative unit. but it is also what keeps a household fed. A loaf of bread is an archaeological object, but for the person holding it, it is simply breakfast. And that is how we should approach this world. Not as a museum display, as a life. The bread is warm. The air is already warming. Someone is preparing another vessel. Someone else is carrying water. The smell of grain mixes with smoke. And for a moment, this ancient morning does not feel particularly ancient. It feels human. Someone is hungry. Someone is busy. Someone is waiting. Someone is telling a child to be careful. Someone is trying to finish a task before the heat becomes stronger. Nothing about that requires a pharaoh. And perhaps that is the first great surprise. You could remove the pyramids from Egypt. Remove the golden mask. Remove the famous kings. Remove the grand temples. And Egypt would still be recognizable. Because Egypt was also this. A person grinding grain. A family sharing bread. A worker carrying water. A boat crossing the river. A child watching an adult work. A household preparing for another day. The world is waking. And now you have to decide what to do. You have eaten. At least for the moment. But the day has only begun. The sun is rising higher. The shadows are becoming shorter. And somewhere outside, work is already underway. You step toward the doorway. The heat is waiting. The day has not yet reached its hardest hours. You have only just eaten. You have not yet worked in the fields. You have not yet carried anything heavy. You have not yet spent hours beneath the Egyptian sun. You have not yet discovered how much your social position determines what happens next. And you have not yet entered the house at midday, when the outside world becomes almost unbearably bright. For now, the river continues moving. The bread is being shared. The first tasks of the day are underway. And the sun climbs higher. The sun has climbed high enough now that the world has changed. Only a few hours ago, the Nile Valley was cool and gray, and the river seemed almost hidden beneath the early light. But now the sky has become an enormous field of brightness. The mud brick walls are beginning to glow with reflected heat, and the shadows beneath doorways have become precious places where people can pause for a moment before returning to their work. You notice the sun first on your shoulders, then your face, then your hands. The warmth is not dramatic at first. It simply accumulates, a little more with every passing minute. Ancient Egyptians did not have modern temperature measurements available to them, and they did not need them to understand the climate. They knew what the morning meant. They knew when the heat would intensify. They knew which activities were better performed early. They knew where shade could be found. They knew which materials remained cool for longer. They knew how clothing behaved in the heat. They knew how much water to carry. They knew when the riverbank offered relief. And most importantly, they had spent their entire lives learning how to live in this environment. You have not. That distinction matters more than the temperature itself. A modern visitor can tolerate heat for a while. What the modern visitor lacks is the accumulated knowledge of heat. The ancient Egyptian worker does not need to think consciously about every movement. The body has learned. The hands know. The feet know. The eyes know. The household knows. The village knows. The entire community has adapted. You are still thinking about it. That is tiring. You walk along a path between buildings. The ground is uneven. There are no smooth modern roads here. No painted sidewalks. No signs telling you where to go. The path belongs to everyone who uses it. People pass carrying things. An animal moves through. A child steps aside. Someone calls from a doorway. A worker leans against a wall. The settlement is not silent. But it is not loud in the way a modern city is loud. There is no constant engine noise. No distant highway. No airplane overhead every few minutes. No electrical hum. The sounds are smaller. Closer. a pot, a voice, a footstep, a tool, a bird, an animal, water, wind. And because the soundscape is smaller, each sound seems more distinct. You begin to hear how far away people are. You begin to hear where activity is concentrated. You begin to understand why the ancient night will feel so different later. For now, though, the day belongs to work. And work is where the modern visitor begins to understand the meaning of physical survival. Imagine that someone asks you to spend the morning doing the work that keeps a household alive. Not for an hour. Not as an exercise. Not as an experience designed for tourists. As ordinary life. You need to move things. You need to carry things. You need to prepare things. You need to repair things. You need to work outside. You need to work repeatedly. And if you are a farmer, your relationship with the earth is especially direct. The Egyptian farmer was not merely someone who stood beside a field. Agriculture involved a network of tasks tied to the river and the seasons. Land had to be prepared. Seeds had to be sown. Animals had to be managed. Crops had to be tended. Harvest had to be gathered. Grain had to be processed and stored. Tools had to be maintained. And all of it depended upon timing. A field could not simply be told to wait. The Nile's seasonal cycle mattered. The agricultural year mattered. The weather mattered. The availability of labor mattered. And the needs of the household mattered. The work was physical, but it was also deeply organized. This is another misconception worth leaving behind. Ancient Egypt was not primitive chaos. It was an administrative civilization. Officials recorded goods. Scribes recorded workers. Institutions collected and distributed resources. Temples possessed land and wealth. Royal projects required enormous logistical systems. Even ordinary work existed within structures of obligation and organization. The survival of workers' records at Deir el-Medina makes this especially clear. That small piece of writing tells us something enormous. People had schedules. People had responsibilities. People could be absent. People had excuses. People became sick. People had family problems. People needed to care for relatives. People had disagreements. And someone had to record all of it. The ancient world was not made entirely of anonymous workers. It contained paperwork. And paperwork means bureaucracy. You might have imagined ancient Egypt as a civilization of monumental statues and mysterious rituals. Instead, you are beginning to discover something much more familiar. There are administrators. There are work schedules. There are supply chains. There are household budgets. There are complaints. There are records. There are people asking where something has gone. There are people explaining why they did not appear for work. There are people trying to make systems function. In other words, there are people trying to get through the week. And that may be the most universal thing in the entire story. The sun continues upward. You find shade beneath a wall. For a moment, the difference is astonishing. Outside the shadow, the light is intense. Inside it, the air feels different. The wall is not simply a boundary. It is shelter. Mud brick can provide useful thermal mass, absorbing heat during the day and releasing it more gradually. Ancient builders did not need modern engineering terminology to understand practical architecture. They knew what worked. A thick wall, a shaded courtyard, a small opening, a roof, a place to sit away from direct sunlight. Architecture becomes climate knowledge made solid. And the same principle appears everywhere. Clothing is climate knowledge. Sleeping arrangements are climate knowledge. Working hours are climate knowledge. The location of houses is climate knowledge. The use of shade is climate knowledge. The timing of agricultural work is climate knowledge. You are beginning to see the civilization as a collection of adaptations. And perhaps this is why the title of this episode is slightly unfair. You probably would not last a day in ancient Egypt. But that does not mean ancient Egyptians were constantly suffering. They had learned to live there. The difficult thing for you would be the transition. You would be entering a world without your habits. You would be carrying a modern body into an ancient rhythm. And the body does not adapt instantly. The first thing you would miss is probably not your phone. It would be water. Not because ancient Egyptians were necessarily dehydrated every day, but because modern people have become accustomed to effortless access. You turn a handle. Water appears. Here, water has a history. It came from somewhere. It was carried, stored, protected, used, and eventually replenished. A jar of water is not merely a container. It represents labor. The person who filled it, the person who carried it, the path they walked, the place where it was stored, the household that depends upon it. The water itself may have taken minutes to collect, but the system that brings it to your room is measured in human effort. That is difficult to see when the system works. Ancient Egyptians could not make the effort disappear. They lived alongside it. You see someone carrying a vessel. The movement is practiced. The weight is familiar. The pace is steady. The person is not performing a heroic feat. That is simply how the water gets there. And you realize something. The ancient world contains an enormous amount of invisible strength. Not the strength of warriors. Not the strength of athletes. The strength of repetition. A person who carries water every day develops a different relationship with weight. A person who grinds grain every day develops a different relationship with stone. A person who walks to fields every morning develops a different relationship with distance. A person who works beneath the sun develops a different relationship with heat. The body becomes part of the infrastructure. That sentence is worth remembering. The body becomes part of the infrastructure. Where machines are absent, muscles fill the gap. Where engines are absent, animals fill the gap. Where electricity is absent, daylight determines the schedule. Where refrigeration is absent, food preservation becomes a skill. Where instant communication is absent, memory and messengers become important. Ancient life is not simply a life with fewer objects. It is a life where the human body is asked to do more. And the sun keeps climbing. You begin to understand why shade matters. A patch of shade is not decorative. It is useful. A doorway is useful. A courtyard is useful. A roof is useful. A tree is useful. A piece of cloth stretched overhead is useful. Every little change in the environment matters. You start looking for shade automatically. That is perhaps your first small adaptation. You are learning. Slowly. The ancient Egyptian beside you is already several thousand mornings ahead. There is a popular image of ancient Egypt in which enormous monuments simply appear. A pyramid stands in the desert. A temple rises beside the river. A colossal statue sits in the sunlight. A tomb is painted with scenes of abundance. And because stone survives, the civilization can sometimes appear to have been made entirely from stone. But stone does not move itself. The monument is the visible end of a much larger system. Behind every block is a quarry. Behind the quarry are workers. Behind the workers are tools. Behind the tools are materials. Behind the materials are transport systems. Behind transport are boats, animals, roads, laborers, officials, food supplies, water, and records. And behind all of it are households. Someone has to feed the people doing the work. Someone has to make the clothing. Someone has to repair the tools. Someone has to move the stone. Someone has to record the supplies. Someone has to oversee the project. Someone has to carry the information. Someone has to maintain the settlement. The monument is only the final shape. The The real machine is human. You are standing near a community of workers. Not all workers in ancient Egypt worked directly for the pharaoh, and not every monumental project followed the same system. But royal building and funerary projects depended upon organized labor. Communities such as Deir el-Medina offer an unusually detailed glimpse into one such specialized workforce. The people who created some of the most famous royal tombs were not mysterious figures who lived only for their work. They had homes. They had families. They owned possessions. They borrowed things. They argued. They worshipped. They became sick. They missed work. They made mistakes. They had ordinary problems. And that makes their achievements more impressive. Because they were not machines. They were people. You walk through a settlement like Deir el-Medina in your imagination. The houses are close together. Walls rise from mud brick. Doorways open toward narrow streets. Domestic spaces are compact. The village is not a grand palace. There are no endless marble halls. There is no sense of empty luxury. It feels lived in. That is important. Archaeology becomes most powerful when you can imagine people moving through the spaces. A person carrying a vessel. A child sitting near a doorway. Someone preparing food. A worker returning from the necropolis. A family speaking together. A neighbor stopping briefly. A craftsperson cleaning tools. Someone writing. Someone resting. The royal tombs above the village may contain extraordinary images, but below them is a community of ordinary lives. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of ancient Egypt. The people who built monuments to eternity still had to deal with Tuesday. They had to find food. They had to settle arguments. They had to look after children. They had to repair roofs. They had to sleep. They had to go to work. And they had to come home. There is something almost comforting about that. History often makes people seem larger than life. Archaeology gives them back their ordinary size. A worker becomes a person standing in a doorway. A scribe becomes someone holding a writing tool. A household becomes a group of people sitting together. A monument becomes a workplace. The pharaoh becomes distant. The worker becomes close. And perhaps that is where we should remain. Close. You are watching the craftsman prepare for work. The tools are simple compared with modern equipment. Copper and bronze tools existed, depending upon period and task, along with stone tools and other implements. The craftsman understood their materials intimately. Stone behaves differently depending upon its type. Pigments behave differently. Plaster behaves differently. Wood behaves differently. Linen behaves differently. Clay behaves differently. The ancient artisan's skill was partly an accumulated knowledge of materials. You do not need a modern instruction manual if you have learned from someone who learned from someone else. The knowledge travels through generations. A hand learns where to strike. An eye learns what shape to expect. A worker recognizes a problem before a modern outsider even notices it. That is expertise. And expertise changes the meaning of simple tools. A modern observer might look at an ancient tool and think, how could anyone accomplish anything with that? But the question is backward. The ancient craftsperson would look at a modern machine and ask, how can you operate this without knowing what the material is telling you? Every technology contains a culture of knowledge. Ancient Egypt had its own, and the craftspeople were specialists. Some painted, some carved, some worked stone, some prepared pigments, some made objects, some wrote, some managed materials. The tombs we admire are the result of countless individual decisions. The angle of a line, the pressure of a brush, the preparation of a wall, the selection of a pigment, the movement of a chisel, the organization of a team, the delivery of supplies, the preservation of tools, the schedule of work. It is tempting to imagine that the ancient Egyptian state could command anything simply because the pharaoh was powerful. But power still requires logistics. And logistics requires people. You see that in the records. Workers appear. Workers disappear. Supplies are distributed. Absences are recorded. Complaints emerge. The human element never goes away. Think about how intimate that is. Thousands of years later, we can still glimpse a person who did not go to work. Not because they wanted to leave a message for us. Because someone wrote it down. And now the record has survived. A tiny administrative fragment becomes a doorway. You can almost imagine the morning. A worker is missing. Someone notices. Someone asks why. Someone records the answer. The day continues. The tomb continues. The kingdom continues. And somewhere, an ordinary person is dealing with an ordinary problem. History is full of these quiet moments. They are easy to miss because they are not spectacular. But tonight, they are the center of the story. By the middle of the day, the streets begin to empty. Not completely. Ancient Egypt did not simply stop because the sun was high. But activity changes. The strongest heat encourages people to seek shade. And this is the moment when we step inside. The doorway is low. The interior is darker than the street. For a moment, your eyes need to adjust. Then shapes begin to appear. A wall. A vessel. A mat. A storage container. A doorway leading deeper into the house. The temperature feels different. Not cold, but protected. The house is a shelter from the brightness outside. This is where we need to slow down. Because when people imagine ancient Egypt, they often imagine temples. But most people did not live in temples. They lived in houses. And the house is where a civilization becomes intimate. The walls are not impressive. That is exactly why they matter. They were not designed primarily to impress people thousands of years later. They were designed to work. The house had to protect people from heat. It had to provide storage. It had to accommodate cooking. It had to support sleeping. It had to create some degree of privacy. It had to function as a place where family life could happen. The courtyard or open area could become an important working space. Cooking might take place outdoors or in areas with better ventilation. Food preparation could spill into open spaces. Domestic work did not disappear behind the walls of a modern kitchen. It was part of daily life. You can almost smell it. Grain. Smoke. Warm clay. Bread. Human bodies. Animals. Dust. The smells of the household. This is one of the senses that archaeology cannot fully preserve. We have vessels. We have floors. We have walls. We have tools. But we do not have the smell of an Egyptian village on an ordinary afternoon. We can only infer. And perhaps that uncertainty makes the scene more interesting. Because your imagination must complete it. You hear a vessel being placed on a surface. You hear someone moving in another room. Outside, the brightness continues. Inside, the light is softer. There is a rhythm to the house. The household is not idle. Even when the street grows quiet, domestic work continues. Food must be prepared. Clothing must be managed. Children must be watched. Objects must be cleaned. Water must be used carefully. Tools must be stored. The house is an economic unit. A family is not simply a group of people living together. It is a cooperative system. Everyone's work matters. This is especially important because ancient households did not have the same separation between home life and economic life that many modern people experience. A household could produce, store, process, repair, teach, feed, raise children, care for relatives, and maintain social relationships. The house was part of the economy. and the economy was part of the house. You sit for a moment. The floor is hard. The room is dim. Outside, a bird calls. You can hear movement beyond the wall. For the first time since sunrise, you are not directly beneath the sun, and you begin to understand why shade was not simply comfort. It was a resource. The modern world has made temperature almost invisible. We walk from an air-conditioned room into an air-conditioned vehicle and then into another air-conditioned building. The temperature follows us. Ancient people followed the temperature. They moved. They changed activities. They used architecture. They adjusted clothing. They worked at different times. The environment shaped the day. You cannot escape it, but you can learn it. And ancient Egyptians did. This is why it is important not to romanticize their hardship. They were not spending every day wishing they lived somewhere else. This was home. The Nile was home. The heat was home. The mud brick was home. The rhythm of work was home. The darkness was home. The stars were home. The limitations were simply the boundaries of ordinary existence. And humans are remarkably good at turning boundaries into habits. You would struggle because you would notice every limitation. They did not. They noticed opportunities. Shade. Water. A breeze. A good harvest. A boat arriving. A cool evening. A full grain store. A successful repair. A day without illness. A family gathered together. Comfort does not require luxury. Sometimes comfort is simply familiarity. The house becomes familiar because you know where everything is. The vessel is in its place. The mat is in its place. The tools are in their place. The family members know their routines. The evening will arrive. The lamp will be lit. The same walls will surround you. There is something deeply human in that. Thousands of years separate us. Yet the desire for a familiar room remains. So far, the day has been difficult, but it has also been ordinary. That distinction matters. The ancient world was not an endless emergency. Most people were not constantly running from danger. They were living. And living includes things going wrong. A tool breaks. A person becomes sick. A roof needs repair. A crop performs badly. A shipment arrives late. A family argument grows serious. A child falls. A worker cannot go to work. A river behaves differently than expected. A household runs short of something. The ancient world contains uncertainty. The difference is that modern people have built enormous systems designed to soften it. Ancient Egyptians had systems too, but those systems were smaller, slower, and much more dependent on relationships. Family mattered. Neighbors mattered. Officials mattered. Temples mattered. Work communities mattered. The household was the first line of support, then the wider community, and beyond that, institutions. If something went wrong, the answer might not be a machine. It might be another person. That sounds comforting. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it was not. Social position mattered enormously. So did wealth. So did access. A wealthy household could absorb a failed harvest more easily than a poor one. An official could have different options from a field worker. A specialized craftsman might possess skills and connections unavailable to someone else. Ancient Egypt was hierarchical. It was also intensely interconnected. Those two facts existed together. You cannot understand one without the other. This is where illness becomes particularly revealing. We know that Egyptians possessed medical knowledge, remedies, practitioners, and traditions of healing. Medical papyri preserve treatments and observations, though they do not give us a complete picture of how every ordinary person experienced illness. The important point is not that ancient Egyptians had no medicine. They did. The important point is that medicine existed within a world without modern antibiotics, modern surgery, modern imaging, modern sanitation systems, or modern emergency medicine. A minor problem could remain minor, or it could become serious. You could not assume that the next level of medical technology would be available, and you could not simply search the symptoms online. You had to know people. You had to know remedies. You had to know who could help. And sometimes you had to wait. Waiting is one of the hidden difficulties of ancient life. Modern civilization is built around speed. Ancient life often accepted delay. Messages traveled at human speed. Goods traveled at animal or boat speed. Construction took years. Travel took time. Recovery took time. News took time. Even answers took time. You might know that something had happened far away, but you could not immediately know what happened next. There is something strangely peaceful about that, and something unsettling. Tonight, we are mostly interested in the peaceful side, because the slower world changes the mind. You cannot constantly check what is happening elsewhere. There is no endless stream of information. There is only the information that reaches you. The village, the family, the workplace, the river, the sky. That is your world. And perhaps that is one reason ancient people could live with uncertainty differently. They had fewer expectations of instant certainty. You wake. You work. You eat. You wait. You hear. You remember. You sleep. The world beyond your horizon can remain unknown. By late afternoon, the light begins to soften. The hardest brightness of midday is passing. The walls are still warm. The river catches the lower sunlight. And the world begins to change again. This is a good moment to understand religion, not as a separate subject, not as a chapter in a textbook, but as something woven into ordinary life. Ancient Egyptian religion was not simply a list of gods. It shaped ideas about order, kingship, death, nature, ritual, morality, and the relationship between humans and the divine. The names are famous. Ra, Osiris, Isis, Horus, Anubis. But the names alone do not tell you what it felt like to live in a world where religious ideas were part of everyday existence. A household could contain small objects connected to religious practice. A worker could have personal devotional practices. A temple could dominate a city's landscape. Funerary beliefs could influence how people thought about death. Images and symbols could appear in homes, workshops, jewelry, writing, architecture, and burial spaces. The gods were not necessarily something you visited once a week. They were part of the conceptual landscape. The river could be understood through religious ideas. The sun could be understood through religious ideas. Death certainly could. The rising sun was not merely a physical event. It belonged to a cosmic order. The setting sun was not merely the end of daylight. It could be interpreted within a much larger religious framework. And this is where modern people can make another mistake. We sometimes imagine that ancient Egyptians believed strange things, while modern people believe rational things. History is rarely that simple. Every civilization builds explanations for existence. Modern people use science, technology, economics, psychology, politics, and countless other systems to interpret reality. Ancient Egyptians used the intellectual and religious frameworks available to them. Within those frameworks, the world made sense. The river had meaning. The king had meaning. Death had meaning. The stars had meaning. The cycle of sunrise and sunset had meaning. Order itself had meaning. That concept of order was deeply important. The world should remain balanced. Chaos should not triumph. The king had a role in maintaining order. Ritual had a role. Temples had a role. The individual had a role. and the ordinary household existed within that larger structure. You may not understand every ritual. You do not need to. Tonight, you are not trying to become an Egyptian theologian. You are simply noticing how different it is to live in a world where religion is not compartmentalized. There is no clear boundary between religious life and normal life. The categories are modern. The ancient world is more blended. And as evening approaches, the boundary between ordinary and sacred becomes even softer. The sun lowers. The river darkens. The first stars appear. A household prepares for night. Someone lights a lamp. The flame is small, almost fragile, but it changes the room completely. The wall that was bright becomes amber. The shadows become longer. The doorway becomes black. The lamp becomes the center of the room. Outside, the world is fading. Inside, people gather. This is the moment the ancient day begins to become quiet, and you realize that you have survived the day. Not comfortably, not effortlessly, but you have survived. You have eaten. You have walked. You have felt the heat. You have watched people work. You have entered a house. You have seen the river. You have watched the sun cross the sky. And now you are tired. Very tired. The ancient Egyptians around you are tired too. But they are accustomed to this feeling. They have done this before. And tomorrow, they will do it again. The lamp burns. The river moves. The night arrives. The first thing that changes after sunset is the light. The second is the sound. The third is the pace. The day does not end all at once. It loosens. A task finishes. Then another. Someone puts away a tool. Someone closes a doorway. Someone brings a vessel inside. Someone checks an animal. Someone prepares the last food. Someone speaks more quietly. The village begins to settle. This is the part of ancient life that is difficult for a modern person to recreate. The world actually becomes dark. There is no glow from distant buildings. No street lights stretching toward the horizon. No illuminated signs. No headlights moving along a road. The darkness is broad. And because it is broad, the stars become important. The night sky over ancient Egypt would have been extraordinary. The Milky Way would have been visible. Constellations would have had meaning. The stars would have appeared brighter because there was so little artificial light competing with them. You step outside. The air has cooled. Not completely. The walls still hold the memory of the day, but the worst heat has passed. The river is darker now. You cannot see every detail. You can hear more than you can see. Water. Insects. A distant animal. Footsteps. Voices. A boat somewhere on the river. Then silence. Not complete silence. Never complete silence. But enough silence to hear yourself think. And this is where the modern visitor might begin to understand something unexpected. Ancient Egypt could be exhausting, but it could also be peaceful. Not because life was easy, because the world had fewer demands on your attention. There was no notification waiting. No message from someone thousands of kilometers away. No breaking news. No glowing screen. No algorithm presenting another story. The night was simply night. If you were finished with your responsibilities, there might be nothing else you were expected to consume. You could sit. Talk. Look at the stars. Listen to the river. Prepare something. Tell a story. Sleep. The absence of information could itself become a kind of rest. Of course, ancient people had worries. They had fears. They had responsibilities. They had conflicts. They had ambitions. They were not permanently serene, but their mental environment was different. The scale was human. And now, after a day inside that scale, you begin to feel it. The village is smaller at night. The walls disappear into darkness. The horizon becomes difficult to see. The river becomes a sound. The stars become the ceiling. A lamp becomes a small sun inside a room. And the entire ancient world seems to shrink down to one household, one family, one flame, one evening. This is the human scale. Empire becomes city. City becomes village. Village becomes house. House becomes room. Room becomes a person. And a person becomes a quiet breath in the darkness. There is still some activity along the river. Not much. A boat moves slowly. Its silhouette is barely visible. The water makes a quiet sound against the hull. Someone calls from the shore. The voice travels farther than it would during the day. Then it disappears. The Nile continues. It has carried the day away. Morning. Heat. Work. Food. Dust. Light. Now darkness. You sit near the river. The ground beneath you is cool enough to be comfortable. The air moves gently. The reeds make a faint sound. You think about the day. At first, it seemed impossible. Everything required effort. Water required effort. Food required effort. Movement required effort. Work required effort. Light required effort. Even understanding where you belonged required knowledge. But the people around you did not experience every task as an obstacle. They experienced it as life. That is an important distinction. What feels difficult to an outsider can feel ordinary to someone who has learned it from childhood. The farmer does not wake each morning thinking, "I must survive another terrible day of agriculture." The craftsperson does not wake thinking, "I must endure another exhausting day of work." The mother does not wake thinking, "I must somehow survive preparing food without modern appliances." The child does not wake thinking, "I am living in a civilization without electricity." They wake. They know what to do. They live. And perhaps that is what ancient history ultimately gives us. Not simply a catalog of things people lacked, but a record of what people learned to do without them. They learned to navigate rivers without engines. They learned to organize harvests without computers. They learned to preserve food without refrigeration. They learned to illuminate rooms without electricity. They learned to build with earth. They learned to weave. They learned to write. They learned to calculate. They learned to observe the sky. They learned to work together. They learned to raise children. They learned to mourn. They learned to celebrate. They learned to sleep. And after thousands of years, that last one remains familiar. You lie down. The room is dark. The lamp is extinguished. The walls are quiet. Outside, the Nile moves. There is no alarm for tomorrow. At least, not the kind you know. Morning will come because morning always comes. The sun will rise. The river will still be there. The fields will still be there. The houses will still be there. And somewhere in the darkness, someone is already dreaming. The night deepens. The Nile Valley is quieter now. The heat has loosened its grip. The walls release the warmth they gathered during the day. The air moves gently across the roofs. The stars remain overhead. And for the first time, there is nothing you need to do. That is perhaps the most unfamiliar feeling of all. You have spent the day inside a civilization that asks the body to participate in almost everything. Now the body can stop. The hands stop grinding. The feet stop walking. The back stops carrying. The tools are put away. The vessels are still. The door is closed. The lamp is gone. Darkness fills the room. And somewhere beyond the wall, the river continues its ancient journey. It was here before the people in this house. It will remain after them. But tonight, it belongs to them. The sound enters the darkness softly. Water. Wind. Reeds. Perhaps an animal. Perhaps a distant voice. Then nothing for a while. You breathe. The ancient world becomes smaller, no longer a kingdom, no longer an empire, no longer a civilization famous for pyramids, just a room, a family, a river, a night. The great monuments are sleeping too. The temples are dark. The workshops are quiet. The fields wait for morning. The boats rest. The tools are still. The houses are closed. And the Nile keeps moving. If you had arrived in Egypt this morning expecting golden treasure, royal ceremonies, and mysterious tombs, you might be disappointed. But if you arrived looking for human life, you would find it everywhere. In every doorway, in every worn tool, in every cooking vessel, in every piece of writing, in every footprint, in every wall, in every grain of dust. The people are gone, but the rhythm remains. Wake, work, eat, rest, watch the river, wait for evening, sleep, then begin again. And perhaps that is why the title of this episode is only half true. You might not last a day in ancient Egypt, not because ancient Egyptians were living in some endless nightmare, but because you would arrive without knowing how. You would not know how to carry water. You would not know the paths. You would not know the rhythms. You would not know the customs. You would not know the work. You would not know the people. You would not know which shadows were useful. You would not know how to read the river. You would not know what the season was asking of you. You would not know what tomorrow required. But an Egyptian child did not wake up knowing these things either. They learned. Slowly. From parents. From neighbors. From work. From mistakes. From observation. From repetition. And one day, the child who once watched someone else carry water would carry it without thinking. The child who watched grain being ground would eventually grind it. The child who watched boats move along the river would learn the river's habits. The child who once needed help navigating the village would one day know every doorway. This is how civilizations survive. Not because everyone is extraordinary, because ordinary people become extraordinarily familiar with ordinary life. The night grows deeper. The room becomes still, and the Nile continues to move. Before we leave, return with me once more to the river. The night is almost completely dark. There is a thin line of stars above the horizon. The Nile reflects almost nothing now. It is simply a darker shape moving through an already dark landscape. You cannot see very far, but you can hear. And perhaps that is enough. Imagine the people sleeping nearby. A farmer, a craftsperson, a child, an old woman, a scribe, a boatman, a family whose names have disappeared. They are not thinking about history. They are not thinking about museums. They are not thinking about documentaries. They are simply sleeping. And that may be the most honest way to remember ancient Egypt. Not as a civilization frozen in stone, but as a civilization that once breathed. People woke in the morning. People complained. People laughed. People worked. People became tired. People worried. People ate. People loved. People argued. People prayed. People waited. People watched the river. People looked at the stars. People went to sleep. And tomorrow, they would do much of it again. The great monuments remain because stone is patient. But ordinary life was made from fragile things. Bread disappeared. Cloth wore out. Wood decayed. Food was eaten. Water evaporated. Voices faded. Footprints vanished. And yet, some traces survived. A wall. A pot. A tool. A letter. A work record. A child's object. A household foundation. A fragment of writing. a little piece of someone's ordinary day. And from those fragments, we reconstruct a world. Not perfectly. Never perfectly. There are gaps. There are uncertainties. There are things we will never know. We cannot know exactly what every Egyptian ate for breakfast. We cannot know exactly what every house smelled like. We cannot know what every child dreamed about. We cannot know every conversation that took place beside the Nile. History is not a recording. It is a reconstruction. But sometimes the fragments are enough to let us stand quietly inside the world. Enough to hear the river. Enough to feel the heat. Enough to see the mud brick walls. Enough to imagine the grain being ground. Enough to understand the extraordinary effort hidden beneath an ordinary meal. Enough to recognize that the people of ancient Egypt were not simply inhabitants of a distant civilization. They were people. And perhaps that is the most important thing to take with you tonight. If you had truly been transported into ancient Egypt, you probably would not have lasted a day without help. You would have been thirsty. You would have been confused. You would have been tired. You would have misunderstood things. You would have searched for conveniences that did not exist. You would have wanted the world to behave like home. It would not. But after a while, something else might happen. You might begin to learn. You might learn where the shade falls. You might learn how to carry the vessel. You might learn the path to the river. You might learn the smell of bread. You might learn when the heat becomes strongest. You might learn when the breeze arrives. You might learn which voices belong to which houses. You might learn the shape of the stars. And slowly, the strange world would become familiar. That is what humans have always done. We arrive somewhere unfamiliar. We learn. We adapt. We make a home. The Egyptians did it. And in one way or another, every human being who has ever lived has done the same. So now let the river remain where it is. Let the fields remain beneath the stars. Let the mud brick houses rest in darkness. Let the tools remain against the walls. Let the boats drift quietly at their moorings. Let the lamps go dark. Morning will come. It always does. The Nile will catch the first light. The birds will call. The doors will open. The grain will be prepared. The fields will wait. And another day in ancient Egypt will begin. But you do not have to follow it. Not tonight. Tonight, you can stay here beside the quiet river for a little longer. There is nothing left to learn. Nothing left to solve. The day is finished. The sun has gone. The work is done. The house is quiet. The river is moving. And somewhere, beneath the ancient Egyptian sky, the last light has disappeared completely. Rest now. Let the old river carry the night forward. Let the distant sounds fade. Let the walls grow still. And let ancient Egypt remain where we found it. Quiet. Warm. Dark beneath the stars. A world that once seemed impossibly distant. A world that, for a little while, felt close. And for tonight, that is where we will leave it. History after dark. Long before the Great Pyramids became symbols of Egypt, before tourists stood beneath them with cameras, and before their silhouettes were reproduced in books and on screens, the Nile Valley was already home to people who understood the river as the center of their world. The civilization did not suddenly appear when a pyramid was completed. It had been gathering slowly, village by village, field by field, generation by generation. Long before stone monuments dominated the horizon, people were learning how to live beside the river, how to cultivate the fertile land, how to store grain, how to make pottery, how to shape tools, and how to organize communities large enough to depend upon one another. If you had arrived then, you would have found a world that looked less monumental and perhaps more familiar. There would still have been houses. There would still have been children. There would still have been cooking fires. There would still have been animals moving through settlements. There would still have been people carrying water. And there would still have been the river. The Nile was not simply a geographical feature. It was the thread that connected lives separated by distance. Along its banks, agriculture could flourish in a landscape that otherwise offered very little dependable rainfall. The contrast was extraordinary. Beyond the cultivated land lay desert. Near the river, there could be fields, palms, reeds, villages, and movement. The boundary could be remarkably sharp. Green life on one side, dry earth on the other. And the ancient Egyptian imagination grew within that contrast. The desert was not merely empty. It had its own meaning. It was dangerous in some places, useful in others, and deeply connected with the geography of death and burial. The cultivated land was the place of living communities. The river was movement and renewal. The desert could become a place of isolation, mining, travel, and tombs. These landscapes were close together. You could walk from one end to another, and that meant that the environment was never far from consciousness. You knew where the water was. You knew where the fields ended. You knew where the desert began. You knew the places where people lived. You knew the places where people buried their dead. A modern person might look across the landscape and see empty space. An Egyptian might see routes, resources, boundaries, memories, sacred places, dangerous places, useful places. The landscape was not empty. It was known. And knowledge of place was one of the first forms of survival. The Nile is moving beside you again. At first glance, it seems almost still. The surface catches the light. A small current moves beneath it. Reeds bend gently at the edge. A bird disturbs the water and then disappears into the distance. The river looks peaceful, but the civilization surrounding it depended upon an enormous amount of knowledge. People had to understand its seasonal behavior. They had to know where water could be accessed. They had to know how fields related to the river. They had to understand irrigation and water management in the contexts where such systems were used. They had to transport goods. They had to cross from one bank to another. They had to navigate. They had to live with both abundance and uncertainty. The river gave. The river could also complicate. A flood that was too low could bring difficulties. A flood that was unusually high could damage settlements or fields. Agricultural life, therefore, depended upon patterns that were larger than any single household. This is one reason the Nile became so central to Egyptian civilization. It connected geography with agriculture, agriculture with taxation, taxation with administration, administration with political power, and political power with the ability to organize resources. The river was therefore not simply something beautiful to look at. It was infrastructure, a road, a source of water, a source of food, a boundary, a transport system, a calendar, a spiritual symbol, and a constant presence. You can imagine waking beside it as a child. The river is there. You grow older. The river is still there. You work. The river is there. You marry. The river is there. Someone in your family dies. The river continues. You become old. The river is still moving. There is something almost impossible to comprehend about living beside a landscape that changes so little in human terms while generations disappear around it. The Nile becomes a kind of continuity. People come and go. The river continues. The houses are rebuilt. The fields change. The rulers change. The names of kings change. The temples are expanded. The roads shift. But the river remains. Perhaps this is part of what made ancient Egyptian culture so deeply concerned with continuity. The world around you constantly reminds you that life is temporary. The river returns. The sun rises. The crops grow. The seasons turn. And human beings pass through. That rhythm could be comforting. It could also be humbling. You stand beside the water. The sun is low. The surface is gold. A boat moves slowly toward the horizon. There is no engine. No mechanical vibration. Only the movement of water and the sound of the wind catching the sail. The boat seems almost weightless. For a moment, the entire civilization becomes quiet. You can imagine grain being carried, stone being carried, wood, pottery, people, messages, goods. Everything moving along the river. The Nile does not merely separate places. It connects them. And because it connects them, the ancient Egyptian world is larger than it first appears. A village may feel small, but the river links that village to other villages. Those villages to towns, towns to cities, cities to temples, temples to estates, estates to officials, officials to the royal administration. The river becomes the thread running through all of it. And now, as the light fades, the river becomes darker. The surface no longer shines. The sound remains. You can hear water touching the bank. That sound would have been familiar to countless generations. A sound older than the monuments, older than the temples, older than the names of many rulers. A sound that needed no explanation. The river was simply there. By evening, the question of food becomes more important. You have worked. You have walked. You have been outside in the heat. Now you are hungry. And this is another place where ancient Egypt becomes surprisingly human. There is no refrigerator waiting in the corner. No supermarket nearby. No packaged meal. No delivery service. Food has to exist because somebody produced it, and somebody processed it, and somebody stored it, and somebody prepared it. Bread is especially important to this story. Grain was fundamental to Egyptian life, and bread was a major component of the diet. Beer was also an important beverage, though ancient Egyptian beer was not identical to the drinks commonly associated with the word today. Together, grain-based foods and beer could provide a substantial part of everyday nourishment. Then there were vegetables, fruits, fish, legumes, and other foods depending upon period, location, social status, and availability. Meat existed, but access to meat was not necessarily the same for everyone. The ancient Egyptian diet was shaped by resources, and resources were shaped by geography. The river provided fish. The fields provided grain. Gardens could provide vegetables. Fruit could be cultivated. Animals could provide milk, meat, labor, and other resources. The desert and surrounding landscapes offered additional possibilities for hunting and gathering in certain contexts. The meal on your plate therefore represents an entire network. You look at a piece of bread. It seems simple. But behind it is a field. Behind the field is soil. Behind the soil is water. Behind the harvest is labor. Behind the grain is storage. Behind storage is protection. Behind preparation is grinding. Behind grinding is physical effort. Behind cooking is fuel. The bread is simple. The system is not. And this is one of the great hidden truths of history. The simplest objects can contain enormous amounts of labor. A modern loaf of bread hides most of its production process. You see it on a shelf. The ancient household could see more of the chain. The grain arrived. Someone cleaned it. Someone ground it. Someone prepared the dough. Someone shaped it. Someone cooked it. The stages were closer to daily experience. And that meant food was not an abstract commodity. It was work. You sit near the household as evening approaches. The smell of bread fills the room. Smoke drifts upward. Someone moves a vessel. Another person prepares food. The day has become domestic. This is perhaps the moment when you finally begin to feel less like an outsider. Because hunger is familiar. The desire for a warm meal is familiar. The smell of food after a long day is familiar. The relief of sitting down is familiar. Thousands of years disappear when you are hungry. The tools may be different. The ingredients may be different. The room may be different. But the body recognizes the moment. You eat. Slowly. Perhaps there is bread. Perhaps vegetables. Perhaps fish. Perhaps a simple grain-based dish. The exact meal would depend upon the household. There was no single ancient Egyptian dinner. That is another modern temptation. We want one answer. What did Egyptians eat? But Egypt contained different regions, social classes, periods, occupations, and circumstances. A royal household did not eat exactly like a farming family. A worker's ration was not necessarily the same as an elite feast. A village near one ecological setting could have access to foods unavailable elsewhere. A feast was not an ordinary meal. A festival was not every day. And archaeology gives us fragments rather than a complete menu. So tonight, we keep the meal simple. Bread. Something from the river. Something from the fields. Perhaps fruit. Perhaps beer. Perhaps a few flavors added by herbs or other ingredients. Nothing needs to be extravagant. The room is already warm. The food is enough. You eat. The day begins to leave the body, and for a few minutes, nothing else matters. Food does not appear because a king commands it. This becomes especially clear when you think about the scale of ancient Egypt. An entire population needs food. Workers need food. Officials need food. Soldiers need food. Temple communities need food. Royal households need food. Boats need crews. Animals need feed. Storage facilities need supplies. The system is enormous. And somewhere at the beginning of the chain is a farmer. Not a romantic figure standing alone in a field beneath a perfect sunset. A working person. Someone whose day is dictated by seasons. Someone who understands soil. Someone who knows animals. Someone who knows when to plant. Someone who knows when to harvest. Someone whose success or failure affects more than the household. The ancient Egyptian state depended heavily upon agricultural production. That does not mean every farmer was simply a servant of the king. Nor does it mean every field was directly controlled in the same way. The social and economic arrangements changed over time. But the larger truth remains. Agricultural surplus made complex society possible. Without surplus, fewer people could specialize. Without specialization, fewer people could become full-time scribes, craftsmen, priests, administrators, soldiers, or builders. A civilization needs food before it can build monuments. This is easy to forget. We look at the pyramid. We see stone. The farmer sees grain. The administrator sees rations. The boatman sees transport. The baker sees flour. The worker sees a meal. The king sees a monument. All of them are looking at the same civilization from different points within the system. And that system requires trust. You plant because you expect a harvest. You harvest because you expect storage. You store because you expect distribution. You work because you expect compensation or provision. You travel because you expect the route to exist. You build because you expect materials to arrive. Every large society depends upon thousands of expectations. When they work, civilization feels effortless. When they fail, everyone notices. Ancient Egypt was remarkably successful at maintaining complex systems for long periods. That does not mean it was stable forever. No civilization is. But its longevity itself tells us something. People learned how to reproduce institutions. They learned how to transmit knowledge. They learned how to organize labor. They learned how to preserve traditions. They learned how to adapt. And they did it without the technologies that make modern organizations seem inevitable. No spreadsheets, no instant messaging, no satellites, no trucks, no industrial refrigeration, no electric pumps. Yet grain moved, stone moved, messages moved, people moved, information moved. The world functioned. Slowly. Humanly. Sometimes imperfectly, but it functioned. And now, as you sit beside the river, the scale of it becomes almost difficult to imagine. Somewhere beyond your view, another household is eating. Somewhere else, a worker is washing. Somewhere else, a scribe is writing. Somewhere else, an official is counting. Somewhere else, a boat is moving. Somewhere else, a farmer is checking a field. All of these lives are happening simultaneously. The kingdom is not one thing. It is thousands of ordinary evenings. Inside another room, someone is still awake. The light is low. A scribe is working. Writing was a specialized skill in ancient Egypt. It required training. It required materials. It required knowledge of language and signs. And it offered access to administrative, religious, and intellectual worlds that were unavailable to most people. You might imagine the scribe sitting in perfect silence, calmly producing beautiful hieroglyphs. Sometimes, perhaps, but much writing was practical. Records had to be made, goods counted, workers noted, transactions documented, letters written, instructions recorded, accounts maintained. The glamorous image of the scribe misses the mundane importance of writing. Writing is administration made visible, and administration is civilization keeping track of itself. The scribe dips the writing tool. The surface waits. The hand moves. A mark appears. Then another. The symbols have meaning. A quantity. A name. A place. An instruction. A record. The document may never become famous. It may concern something completely ordinary. That does not make it unimportant. In fact, ordinary documents are among the most valuable windows into the past. A king's monument tells us how a king wanted to be remembered. A mundane record can tell us what people actually had to deal with. The difference is enormous. A monument says, "Remember me." A work record says, "This person was absent today." A royal inscription says, "The king accomplished something great." A household document might say, "Someone owes something to someone else." The second kind of evidence can feel almost startlingly intimate. You realize that ancient people were not living in a world without paperwork. They were living in a world with paperwork that happened to be written on different materials. And because writing materials could be fragile, much of what existed has disappeared. What survives is only a fraction. The scribe finishes one line. The room is quiet. Outside, the night deepens. The writing remains. The hand stops. The document is put aside, and somewhere thousands of years later, another person will find it. Not this exact scene, not this exact document, but something like it. A fragment of ordinary administration, a little piece of a forgotten day. The scribe does not know that the future is watching. There is no reason to. The scribe is simply working. That may be the most beautiful thing about surviving evidence. People were not performing for history. They were living. The adults have gone quiet, but children are not always ready to sleep. Somewhere nearby, a child is still awake, perhaps sitting near a doorway, perhaps listening to adults talk, perhaps playing with something simple. Children in ancient Egypt were not miniature adults. They had their own experiences. Their lives were shaped by family, household, social status, gender, work, education, and circumstances. Some children likely learned practical skills through observation and participation. Others, particularly those from privileged families, could have access to formal education. The surviving evidence is uneven. We cannot reconstruct every childhood, but we can see hints. Toys and games existed. Educational texts survive. Images show children in various contexts. And family life appears repeatedly in Egyptian art. The child looks toward the adults. The adults continue their conversation. The child listens. Perhaps the child is learning without realizing it. This is how most knowledge travels. Not through formal lessons alone. Through watching. You see someone grind grain. You learn the movement. You see someone weave. You learn the pattern. You watch a boat being prepared. You learn where the ropes go. You hear adults discussing the river. You learn which places matter. You hear names. You learn who belongs to which family. You grow into the landscape. The child does not need a textbook called How to Live in Ancient Egypt. The world itself is the textbook. And perhaps this explains another reason you would struggle. You would be missing childhood. You would be arriving with an adult body, but none of the accumulated cultural knowledge. You would know how to use a modern door handle. You would know how to operate a phone. You would know what a refrigerator does. You would know how to cross a modern street. But none of those skills would help you much here. The child who has never seen a smartphone may be better adapted than you. That is humbling. The ancient child knows the world. You do not. The child knows the riverbank. You do not. The child knows which foods are normal. You do not. The child knows the household routines. You do not. The child knows how adults communicate. You do not. The child knows when to be quiet. You do not. The child has something more valuable than technology. Context. And context is one of the deepest forms of knowledge. You can possess thousands of facts and still not know how to live somewhere. A person who understands the environment can survive with very little. A person who does not understand it can be overwhelmed by abundance. The child continues listening. The adult speaks softly. The lamp burns lower. Soon enough, the child will sleep. Tomorrow, the child will wake in ancient Egypt. You will still be trying to understand where the water comes from. Morning seems distant now, but tomorrow's clothing is already waiting. Clothing is one of those things modern people rarely notice until it becomes uncomfortable. In ancient Egypt, clothing had practical and social meanings. Linen was especially important. The flax plant could be processed into linen fibers, and linen textiles became characteristic of Egyptian clothing. The quality of cloth could vary. Fine linen could be associated with wealth and elite status. Ordinary people had access to simpler textiles. Clothing, therefore, told you something about a person. Not perfectly, but enough. Fabric. Quality. Jewelry. Color. Style. Condition. Accessories. All could communicate social position. And yet clothing also had to work in the climate. A garment could protect the body from sun while allowing air to circulate. Head coverings and other forms of protection could be useful depending upon occupation and circumstance. The body was not dressed only for appearance. It was dressed for life. You run your fingers over a piece of linen. It feels different from modern synthetic fabric. The texture is natural. The weave is visible. The cloth has weight. It has history. Someone cultivated the flax. Someone processed it. Someone spun fibers. Someone wove them. Someone shaped the garment. Again, an ordinary object contains a chain of human effort. You put on a modern shirt without thinking about the labor behind it. Ancient people could also take clothing for granted, but the process was more visible. If a garment was damaged, someone had to repair it. If it became worn, someone had to decide what happened next. If cloth was valuable, it might be reused. Nothing simply disappears into a store. Resources remain resources. That is another difference you would feel quickly. The ancient household is attentive to materials. A broken object might be repaired. A piece of cloth might be reused. A container might serve another purpose. A wooden item might be reshaped. Waste still existed. Of course it did. But the sheer abundance of disposable manufactured goods familiar to modern life was absent. The ancient world required more attention. You looked after things because things mattered. You looked after your tools, your clothing, your containers, your animals, your house, your storage, your food. The household was a place of maintenance. And maintenance is another form of work that modern infrastructure often hides. You do not think about repairing the plumbing because someone else handles it. You do not think about manufacturing your clothes because factories do it. You do not think about grinding grain because machines do it. You do not think about preserving food because refrigeration does it. Ancient life brings many of these processes closer to the household. That is why it feels labor-intensive, not because ancient people were unusually industrious, because the work had nowhere else to go. The cloth is folded. The room is quiet. The garment will be worn tomorrow. Another day begins, and the cycle continues. Beyond the cultivated fields, the land changes. The green becomes thinner. The soil gives way to dry earth. The river's immediate influence weakens. You are approaching the desert. It is tempting to imagine the desert as a simple, empty background behind Egyptian civilization. But the desert was part of the civilization too. Routes crossed it. Quarries existed there. Mineral resources could be found there. Oases offered water and settlement. Burial grounds occupied desert landscapes. Travelers crossed difficult terrain. Workers extracted stone. The desert could isolate. It could protect. It could conceal. It could preserve. And this last quality is especially important. The dry climate of Egypt helped preserve materials that would have decayed more rapidly in wetter environments. Organic remains could survive under favorable conditions. Papyrus. Textiles. Wood. Food remains. Human remains. Objects. The desert could become a time capsule. You walk across the dry ground. The air feels different. There is less vegetation. The horizon seems enormous. Behind you, the Nile Valley is a narrow band of life. Ahead, the desert stretches outward. This contrast helps explain Egyptian geography better than any map. Civilization is concentrated along a ribbon. Beyond it is vast dryness. The river gives life. The desert surrounds it. This geography creates a sense of compression. People live close together. Fields occupy valuable land. Settlements cluster around resources. The river becomes a highway. The desert becomes both barrier and resource. And the distinction between life and death becomes visually powerful. The living cultivate. The dead are buried beyond the cultivated zone. The black earth of the valley and the red or pale desert beyond it become part of the symbolic landscape. The colors themselves matter. Dark fertile soil. Bright desert. Green vegetation. Blue water. Golden light. Ancient Egyptian art repeatedly used a limited but powerful visual vocabulary. The environment itself already looked like a painting. You stand there as the sun lowers. The desert turns warm. The river becomes a narrow ribbon of reflected light. A palm moves gently in the distance. And suddenly you understand why ancient Egyptian landscapes could produce such strong images of order. There is a line. Water. Earth. Desert. Sky. Everything has its place. The world is not infinite. It is sharply defined. And perhaps that makes it easier to understand. The first light is coming again. You have slept. Not perfectly. The room was unfamiliar. The floor was hard. The air was different. The sounds were different. But you slept. And now the world begins again. A bird calls. Someone moves outside. A door opens. The river catches the first light. You sit up. For a moment, you forget where you are. Then you remember. Ancient Egypt. The day begins. And perhaps this is where the title finally becomes clear. You probably would not last a day here. Not because the people were weak. Not because the civilization was miserable. Not because every moment was dangerous. You would struggle because modern life has quietly removed an enormous number of tasks from your daily awareness. You are surrounded by systems. Water systems. Food systems. Transportation systems. Power systems. Communication systems. Medical systems. Manufacturing systems. Waste systems. Climate control systems. Ancient Egyptians had systems too. But the human body stood much closer to them. You would notice the water. You would notice the heat. You would notice the food. You would notice the distance. You would notice the darkness. You would notice the labor. You would notice time. And perhaps most of all, you would notice how much knowledge ordinary people carried without writing it down. A farmer knew. A craftsperson knew. A boatman knew. A baker knew. A mother knew. A child knew. A scribe knew. The civilization depended on millions of small pieces of knowledge. None of them would feel extraordinary to the person who possessed them. But together, they made ancient Egypt possible. That is the quiet secret beneath the monuments. The pyramids were extraordinary. The temples were extraordinary. The tombs were extraordinary. But the most extraordinary thing may have been the ordinary life that made them possible. The people who woke before sunrise. The people who carried water. The people who grew grain. The people who ground flour. The people who shaped linen. The people who repaired tools. The people who built houses. The people who kept records. The people who raised children. The people who cared for the sick. The people who waited for boats. The people who watched the river. The people who went home. The people who slept. Without them, there would have been no monuments. And so, when we look at ancient Egypt, perhaps we should look less often at the stone alone. Look at the hands. The hands behind the stone. The hands behind the bread. The hands behind the writing. The hands behind the boats. The hands behind the cloth. The hands behind the houses. History was built by hands. And tonight, those hands are still visible. Not directly. Not completely. But in every surviving object. Every worn surface. Every tool. Every fragment. Every mark. Every wall. They left traces. And those traces are enough to remind us that the ancient world was once full of ordinary people trying to make another day work. The sun rises. The river shines. The village wakes. And somewhere, an ancient Egyptian begins another morning without wondering whether the day will be historically significant. It is simply Tuesday, or whatever day it was. And that is enough. You do not need a king. You do not need a battle. You do not need a pyramid. You only need the river, the house, the meal, the work, the evening, the stars, and sleep. The sun has barely appeared above the horizon, and already the village is beginning to move. There is no single moment when the day starts. Instead, the settlement wakes gradually, one household at a time, as though a quiet current is passing through the buildings. A doorway opens. Someone steps outside. A vessel is lifted. An animal shifts in its enclosure. A child wakes. A voice carries briefly across the street. Then another. The world gathers itself. This is something you might notice immediately if you stayed here long enough. Ancient mornings are not silent, but they are not hurried in the modern sense either. There is urgency in certain tasks, certainly. The day is governed by the sun. Some work is better done before the strongest heat. Animals need attention. Food must be prepared. People need to reach their workplaces. But there is no universal clock hanging above the settlement telling everyone that they are already late. Time is present in other ways. Light. Shadow. The position of the sun. The season. The habits of the household. The rhythms of work. The movement of boats. The calls of animals. The changing temperature. The ancient Egyptian day is something you inhabit. It is not simply something you measure. And that difference can be difficult for a modern visitor to understand. You are accustomed to minutes. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. Half an hour. A deadline at 8. Another appointment at 9. A train at 9:17. A message expected immediately. Ancient life could certainly involve schedules and appointed times, but the practical experience of time was much more closely connected to natural cycles. You knew when the sun was rising. You knew when the heat would arrive. You knew when the light was changing. You knew when darkness would make certain tasks difficult, and you learned to arrange your life accordingly. This does not mean ancient Egyptians were relaxed about everything. They were not. A person could be late. A worker could be absent. A shipment could be delayed. An official could demand something. A household could have urgent needs. The difference is simply that the clock did not dominate every moment. You step outside. The morning air is still comfortable. This is the best part of the day. The river looks pale. The fields are quiet. The mud brick walls are beginning to catch the light. For a short while, the temperature feels almost gentle. You understand why people would want to begin early. The body has not yet been exhausted by heat. The ground is cooler. The air is easier to breathe. The work ahead is still possible. You watch a farmer preparing to leave. There is nothing ceremonial about it. The person simply gathers what is needed. A tool. A vessel. Perhaps food. The movement is practiced. No wasted motion. No unnecessary thought. This is what familiarity looks like. And you begin to realize that much of ancient survival was not about extraordinary strength. It was about ordinary efficiency, knowing where to place something, knowing how to lift it, knowing how far to walk before resting, knowing when to begin, knowing when to stop, knowing which task should come first. The modern world has its own forms of efficiency. Ancient people had theirs. They simply developed under different conditions. There is a strange intimacy in handmade objects. You can see the person inside them. Not literally, but almost. A bowl has fingerprints in its shaping. A woven textile contains the rhythm of hands. A carved surface records repeated movements. A wooden object carries marks of tools. A piece of pottery has the evidence of its making. The object is not separate from the person who created it. It is the result of a body performing a learned sequence. Ancient Egypt was filled with such objects. Some were magnificent. Others were completely ordinary. And the ordinary ones may be the most interesting. A simple bowl does not need to impress anyone. It only needs to work. A container needs to hold something. A tool needs to perform a task. A mat needs to provide a surface. A garment needs to cover the body. A basket needs to carry things. A vessel needs to survive repeated use. The ancient world was filled with functional beauty. Objects were often made because they were needed. And when you live in a world without mass-produced abundance, the relationship between usefulness and value becomes clearer. You know who made things. You know how difficult they are to replace. You know which materials are scarce. You know which objects belong to which household. You know which tools are worth protecting. You may even recognize an object because you have seen the same type made many times. Craft knowledge is cumulative. The first time you make something, it may be awkward. The 100th time is different. The 1000th time becomes almost unconscious. This is true today as well. A skilled carpenter does not calculate every movement aloud. A skilled baker does not measure every sensation consciously. A skilled musician does not think about every finger. Ancient craftspeople were no different. Their hands had memory. That is something archaeology can only partially reveal. We see the finished object. We do not see the years of practice behind it. A painted figure on a tomb wall may look effortless. It was not. The proportions were learned. The conventions were learned. The materials were learned. The tools were learned. The workshop culture was learned. And then the knowledge was passed on. One person taught another. A master trained an apprentice. A child watched an adult. A worker corrected another worker. Knowledge moved through people, not through the internet, not through instructional videos, not through searchable databases, through presence. You had to be there. You had to watch. You had to practice. You had to remember. That made knowledge more local. A particular workshop might possess knowledge that another workshop did not. A family might have a specialized craft tradition. A community might understand a local resource better than outsiders. The ancient world was full of these small islands of expertise. And from a distance, they disappear. You see Egypt. One civilization. One name. One great culture. But from inside, there were countless communities. Countless skills. Countless traditions. Countless households. A person did not wake up thinking, I am participating in the civilization of ancient Egypt. The person woke up thinking, I have work to do. That difference is essential. History is often described from above. Kings, dynasties, wars, temples, monuments. But history is also built from below. Bread, cloth, tools, water, children, work, sleep. And the more closely you look, the more the enormous civilization becomes a collection of small human routines. Imagine walking toward a workshop during the morning. You hear it before you see it. A repeated sound. Then another. Wood against wood. Stone against stone. A tool striking. A voice speaking. Someone moving a container. The sound is rhythmic. Not loud enough to dominate the entire settlement, but steady. You enter. The light is stronger here. Dust hangs in the air. Materials are arranged around the workers. The room is not filled with machines. There is no continuous mechanical vibration. No electric motor. No conveyor belt. No fluorescent lighting. Every movement is visible. Every object has to be placed somewhere. Every tool has to be picked up. Every material has to be moved. This makes the workshop feel slower than a modern factory. But slow does not mean unproductive. Human beings can accomplish extraordinary things through repetition. A skilled craftsperson can perform thousands of movements in a day, and the accumulation becomes significant. One cut. Another. 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 A shape appears. One brushstroke. Another. Another. A figure emerges. One woven thread. Another. Another. A textile forms. This is the mathematics of ancient craftsmanship, not speed. Accumulation. The finished object hides the number of movements that created it. A statue looks still. Its creation was not. A wall looks permanent. Its construction was not. A painted tomb looks effortless. Its decoration was not. The silence of the finished object conceals the noise of its making. That is why it can be useful to imagine the workshop while looking at a monument. The monument is the quiet end of a noisy process. And somewhere, the people who made it are tired. Their hands ache. Their backs ache. Their eyes are tired from concentrating. Their clothing carries dust. They have eaten. They have talked. They have perhaps complained. Then they return home. This is where the ancient world becomes almost startlingly recognizable. Work is work. Regardless of century, regardless of technology, regardless of empire. There is a moment at the end of the day when a person has simply had enough. The tools are put down. The shoulders relax. The mind begins to leave the workplace. Home becomes attractive. Food becomes attractive. Water becomes attractive. Silence becomes attractive. Rest becomes attractive. And the human body does not care whether the work was performed beneath the shadow of a pyramid or inside a modern office. It recognizes fatigue. There is another side to ancient work that should not be softened. Not everyone entered their occupation freely. Ancient Egyptian society contained hierarchy, obligations, forms of dependency, and systems of labor that varied enormously across time and place. Some people possessed considerable wealth and influence. Others had very little. Some workers had specialized skills. Others performed physically demanding agricultural or construction labor. Some people held positions of authority. Others lived under obligations imposed by institutions or more powerful individuals. So when we talk about the ordinary Egyptian, we must be careful. There was no single ordinary Egyptian. A wealthy official and a poor agricultural worker did not experience the same Egypt. A royal family and a village household did not experience the same Egypt. A skilled tomb worker and an agricultural laborer did not necessarily have the same opportunities. A person living in a major city experienced different possibilities from someone living in a rural settlement. And the experience of women could differ according to class, household, occupation, and period. The civilization was complicated because people were complicated. This is why the idea that you would not last a day should not become an excuse to imagine all ancient Egyptians as miserable. Some had comfortable lives. Some had wealth. Some had social influence. Some had secure households. Some enjoyed leisure. Some lived in beautiful homes. Some possessed fine clothing and jewelry. Others struggled. Both realities existed. The Nile Valley was not a single social class. It was a society. And societies contain differences. You walk past a larger house. It stands out. The walls are more substantial. The spaces are larger. The household possesses more objects. Perhaps there is more food. Perhaps there are servants or workers. Perhaps there are gardens or more elaborate furnishings. Then you look back toward the smaller houses. The difference is visible. Ancient inequality was not hidden behind modern architecture. Wealth could be seen in space, in materials, in clothing, in possessions, in food, in access, in burial, and in the ability to command other people's labor. This is another reason the monuments can be misleading. A magnificent tomb does not mean everyone in Egypt lived magnificently. The resources required for monumental construction were concentrated. The beauty of the surviving elite objects tells us about the people who could afford them. The quieter objects tell us about everyone else. A simple bowl, a worn tool, a modest house, a workman's settlement. These objects may not look impressive, but they can bring us closer to everyday life. The absence of luxury is itself evidence. You look around. Most of the world is not gold. It is mud brick, linen, wood, clay, stone, Earth. Human hands. That is the texture of ordinary civilization. From the settlement, you can see the upper parts of a temple. The architecture rises beyond the houses. Its scale separates it from ordinary buildings. The temple is not simply a place where people gather casually. Temples were major religious and economic institutions. They could possess land. They could employ people. They could receive offerings. They could manage resources. They could participate in the wider administration of society. The temple, therefore, belongs to both the sacred and practical worlds. From a distance, it appears timeless. Up close, it is a workplace. People clean. People maintain. People prepare offerings. People manage supplies. People perform rituals. People write records. People repair buildings. People organize movement. A sacred institution still requires ordinary labor. Stone needs maintenance. Food needs preparation. Textiles need care. Records need keeping. People need to be fed. The divine world does not eliminate practical work. It depends upon it. This is another pattern that appears throughout human history. The grandest institutions still depend on small tasks. A temple is a system. A palace is a system. A city is a system. A ship is a system. A household is a system. And every system contains people doing repetitive things that history rarely remembers. You might never know the name of the person who swept a particular temple floor. You might never know the person who carried a particular basket. You might never know the person who repaired a particular doorway. But the doorway survived. The floor remained clean. The basket reached its destination. The system worked. History tends to remember the person who commissioned the monument. Archaeology sometimes remembers the person who built it. But most of the people involved disappear. Their anonymity is not evidence that they were unimportant. It is evidence that the surviving records were created unevenly. The powerful had more opportunities to leave written and monumental traces. The poor left objects, buildings, bones, tools, waste, footprints, fragments. And sometimes those fragments speak more quietly than inscriptions. You stand in the shadow of the temple. The stone is warm. The air smells of dust. A bird passes overhead. For a moment, the monument feels less like a symbol of power and more like a building made by people. That is a useful way to see it. Not as something that simply existed, as something that was maintained. Every generation inherited structures from earlier generations. Some expanded them. Some repaired them. Some abandoned them. Some reused them. History is not a straight line. It is layers. The river is busy again. This time you notice how many things move by water. A boat carries people. Another carries goods. A smaller craft rests near the shore. The Nile makes transport possible across long distances. And this changes the geography of Egypt. On land, distance can be exhausting. By river, movement can become much easier under favorable conditions. The river therefore acts like a road. But unlike a road, it moves. Wind matters. Current matters. Season matters. Navigation matters. Boat construction matters. The skills of the crew matter. A journey still takes time. There are no engines. No GPS. No instant route calculation. The boat is a relationship between people, materials, water, and wind. And once again, the ancient Egyptian world becomes a world of practical knowledge. A sailor learns the river. A boat builder learns wood. A crew learns balance. A navigator learns landmarks. A traveler learns patience. The journey itself becomes part of life. You cannot simply leave at a moment's notice and arrive somewhere immediately. Travel requires preparation. Food. Water. Cargo. Crew. Timing. The destination might be known, but the journey still unfolds at the speed of the river. This changes the feeling of distance. Modern people can cross Egypt in ways ancient people could never have imagined. We experience geography compressed. Ancient people experienced it stretched out. A city was far away because it took time to reach. A distant relative was genuinely distant. News from another region could arrive after days or longer. The world was not smaller because maps were smaller. It was larger because movement was slower. And perhaps that made local places more meaningful. Your village mattered. Your riverbank mattered. Your neighboring settlement mattered. The market mattered. The temple mattered. The route mattered. You knew your immediate world in detail. The distant world existed, but it was not constantly entering your mind. You could live your entire day without thinking about events hundreds of kilometers away. Today, information travels faster than thought. Ancient information traveled at the pace of a person. That difference would be difficult to reverse. You might spend the first day wondering what was happening elsewhere. Then you would gradually discover that nothing required you to know. The river was enough. The household was enough. The work was enough. The evening was enough. At another hour, the settlement becomes more active. People gather. Goods change hands. Food is displayed. Containers are opened. Voices overlap. The market is not a modern supermarket. There are no endless shelves. No refrigerated section. No printed barcodes. No plastic packaging. Instead, you see things directly. Produce. Bread. Fish. Textiles. Crafts. Tools. Containers. Perhaps animals. Perhaps goods arriving from elsewhere. Trade could occur through various forms of exchange, including barter and systems involving measured commodities and units of value. Money as we know it was not the organizing principle of the earliest Egyptian economy. This means that value can feel more physical. A quantity of grain. A length of cloth. A piece of metal. A vessel. A tool. A service. The object itself matters. The measure matters. The agreement matters. The relationship matters. You watch two people negotiate. You cannot understand every word, but you recognize the gestures. One person points. The other considers. Someone weighs or measures. A decision is made. The exchange occurs. And life continues. Markets are among the most familiar places in ancient history because they reveal something universal. People need things. People have things. People exchange things. People negotiate. People compare. People complain about prices. People search for better goods. People know which seller is reliable. The technology changes. The behavior remains. You smell food. That alone tells you that you are close to other people. Smoke rises. A vendor calls. Someone laughs. A child moves through the crowd. An animal becomes impatient. A basket is lifted. A vessel is passed. The market is alive. And perhaps this is where you begin to realize that ancient Egypt was not quiet all the time. It was quiet at night. It was peaceful beside the river. But during the day, communities could be active. People interacted. They argued. They traded. They traveled. They worked. They celebrated. They attended festivals. They gathered. The sleepiness comes later. For now, the world is awake. Not every day was identical. This is important. If ancient Egypt consisted only of work, food, and sleep, we would be missing a large part of human life. People need occasions that interrupt routine. Festivals provided some of those occasions. Religious festivals could involve processions, offerings, music, food, drinking, and gatherings. The exact practices varied enormously depending upon the festival, deity, location, and period. But the larger principle is familiar. A society needs moments when ordinary time feels different. A festival tells people, today is not like yesterday. Today matters. Today people gather. Today there is music. Today there is food. Today there are rituals. Today the ordinary rhythm changes. For a modern person, this is perhaps one of the easiest aspects of ancient life to understand. We still mark special days, birthdays, weddings, religious holidays, national holidays, family gatherings, feasts, festivals. The details change. The need does not. People create special time. And in ancient Egypt, religious festivals could also reinforce connections between communities, institutions, and the gods. Imagine approaching a festival after days of ordinary work. The atmosphere is different. More people are outside. Clothing may be more carefully prepared. Food may be more abundant. Music may be present. The temple becomes a focal point. The streets change. The usual work rhythm is interrupted. You are surrounded by people. And perhaps, for a few hours, the burdens of ordinary work feel distant. This is important when imagining the ancient worker. Do not imagine someone who worked every waking moment. Humans need rest. They have always needed rest. There were breaks. There were meals. There were festivals. There was leisure. There were social gatherings. There was sleep. There were moments when nothing productive happened. Ancient people were not machines. They could sit. They could talk. They could play. They could drink. They could listen to music. They could enjoy company. The archaeological record is filled with evidence of people seeking pleasure and comfort alongside work and obligation. And this is another place where the ancient world becomes familiar. A person finishes a difficult day. Someone offers food. Someone begins a song. People gather. The evening feels different. For a while, no monument needs to be built. No field needs to be harvested. No record needs to be written. People simply exist together. That may be one of the oldest forms of rest. Water is precious, yet cleanliness still matters. Ancient Egyptians had practices of washing and personal grooming, though these should not be imagined as identical to modern bathing routines. Personal cleanliness could have religious, social, and practical dimensions. People used water. They cared for hair. They used oils and other substances. They managed clothing. They cared about appearance. Elite and ordinary practices differed, but the larger point is simple. Ancient people were not unaware of hygiene. The misconception that everyone in antiquity was simply dirty is another modern shortcut. Human beings have always noticed discomfort, sweat, dust, odor, heat, dirty clothing, the feeling of water on skin. Ancient Egyptians lived in a hot environment. They knew what dust felt like. They knew what sweat felt like. They knew the relief of washing. The river itself was part of daily life, although one should not imagine that everyone simply bathed in the Nile whenever convenient. Different forms of washing and water use existed in different contexts. Containers allowed water to be transported. Households could use water for many purposes, and oils and cosmetics could serve practical as well as aesthetic roles. A person could care about appearance without possessing modern cosmetics. A person could want clean clothing without owning a washing machine. A person could groom without a bathroom. The desire for comfort is ancient. You sit beside the water. Your hands are dusty. You wash them. The sensation is immediate. Coolness. Relief. The dust disappears. For a moment, the day feels lighter. It is a small experience, But small experiences are the foundation of daily life. The ancient world was full of them. The relief of shade, the first sip of water, the smell of fresh bread, the feel of clean linen, the coolness of evening, the sound of familiar voices, the sight of the river at sunset, the darkness of a room after the lamp goes out. These moments rarely enter history books, but they are the moments that make life feel lived. And perhaps that is what we should seek when we enter the ancient world. Not only the extraordinary, the ordinary. Because ordinary life is where history becomes human. By now, if you had actually spent several days in ancient Egypt, your body would begin to change its expectations. You would drink before you were desperately thirsty. You would seek shade before you became exhausted. You would wake earlier. You would notice the wind. You would begin to recognize the smell of the river. You would know where the ground was uneven. You would understand which paths were easier. You would know which room remained cooler. You would learn where water was stored. You would understand how much food to prepare. You would begin to organize your day around the climate. This is adaptation, not the dramatic adaptation of survival stories. The quiet adaptation of habit. Humans are extraordinary at this. Move someone from a modern city to a rural environment, and the first days may feel inconvenient. Weeks later, they develop routines. Months later, those routines feel normal. Children adapt even faster. A person who grows up somewhere learns things that outsiders cannot see. They know which tree provides shade, which road becomes muddy, which stream rises after rain, which animal should be avoided, which neighbor can help, which food is safe, which path is shortest, which place is quiet, which place is busy. This is environmental intelligence. Every human culture contains it. Ancient Egypt was no exception. The difference is that many of the adaptations modern people now outsource to technology were once held inside individual memory. You did not need an app to tell you when the sun would set. You could see it. You did not need a weather service to know that the heat was coming. Your body could feel it. You did not need a navigation application to find the river. You knew the landscape. You did not need a calendar notification to remember a seasonal task. The community remembered. This does not mean ancient people had perfect knowledge. They did not. Weather could surprise. Floods could vary. Illness could appear. Crops could fail. But the baseline of knowledge was deeply embodied. And perhaps this is the biggest reason you would struggle. You would have information. They had familiarity. Information tells you what something is. Familiarity tells you what to do. The difference is enormous. You are carrying a vessel again. This time, you pay attention to the weight. It is not enormous, but it is enough. You walk. The vessel shifts slightly. You adjust your grip. Your shoulder begins to notice. Your arm begins to tire. You change hands. The path continues. This is the sort of task that modern life makes easy to forget. Water is heavy. A household needs a lot of it. Drinking, cooking, washing, animals, cleaning, gardening, other daily tasks. Every liter represents weight, and every weight must be moved by someone or something. Ancient Egyptian communities developed systems for managing water, including wells and other sources in different environments, as well as the use of the Nile and channels in agricultural contexts. But the basic physical fact never changes. Water must be moved. A person carries it. An animal carries it. A boat carries it. A system carries it. Someone is doing the work. You walk farther. The vessel seems heavier. Perhaps you would laugh at yourself if anyone could see you. Modern life has given you strange muscles. You are strong enough to carry many things, but not necessarily strong in the specific ways ancient daily tasks demanded. A modern office worker may be perfectly capable of lifting a heavy object once. That does not mean they are prepared to carry water repeatedly. Strength is specific. Endurance is specific. Habit is specific. The ancient household trained bodies through necessity, not through a gym, not through a fitness program, through life. That does not mean every ancient Egyptian was physically stronger than every modern person. Such a claim would be impossible to justify. It simply means that daily activities demanded different patterns of physical effort, and those patterns became ordinary. You reach the house. The vessel is placed down. You realize how satisfying that sound is. Clay touches the floor. The weight leaves your hands. You breathe. Someone else takes over. You have completed one small task. Nothing dramatic happened, and yet you understand the civilization slightly better. Because a civilization is not only made of ideas, it is made of weight. Someone carries the weight. Someone moves the weight. Someone lifts the weight. Someone stores the weight. Someone unloads the weight. The monument is heavy. The grain is heavy. The water is heavy. The clay is heavy. The stone is heavy. Ancient life was physical. And then, slowly, evening arrives. The vessel is empty. The work is done. The river reflects the final light. Smoke rises from a cooking fire. It catches the light. For a moment, you can see the smoke drifting through the room before it disappears. Fire is one of the oldest technologies humans possess. Ancient Egyptians knew how to use it for cooking, warmth when needed, craft production, and other purposes. But fire inside a household changes the atmosphere. It gives light. It gives heat. It creates smell. It creates smoke. It demands fuel. And fuel itself must come from somewhere. Wood. Reeds. Other combustible materials. The household must manage it. A fire that is useful can also become dangerous. It needs attention. It needs to be controlled. It needs to be extinguished when necessary. Modern cooking makes heat almost invisible. Turn a knob. Press a button. The flame appears. Later, press another button. The heat disappears. Ancient cooking required a more direct relationship with combustion. You could see it, hear it, smell it, feel it. The fire becomes part of the room. Food changes over it. Water warms. Bread cooks. Smoke rises. People gather. The kitchen is not merely a separate appliance. It is a process. You watch someone preparing the meal. The movements are familiar. Again, no one is performing for history. They are simply feeding people. That may be the most important activity in any civilization. Before monuments, before politics, before literature, before armies. People need food, and someone must prepare it. The person tending the fire is participating in history as surely as the pharaoh. The difference is that no statue will be built for them. No enormous inscription will record their name. But without that meal, someone else cannot work. Without food, the household cannot function. Without households, the kingdom cannot function. The ordinary task supports the extraordinary institution. You sit nearby. The fire is low. The smell of cooked food fills the room. Outside, the last sounds of the day continue. Someone walks past. A voice fades. A vessel is moved. Then quiet. The fire remains. Eventually, the lamps become fewer. The village is mostly dark. Now look upward. The sky is enormous. In a world without electric light, darkness reveals things that modern cities hide. Stars. Planets. The moon. The changing brightness of the night. Ancient Egyptian astronomy was sophisticated, and celestial observation mattered for calendars, religious thought, and the organization of time. The sky was not simply beautiful. It was useful. It helped humans understand cycles. But beauty and usefulness do not need to be separated. A person can look at the stars because they matter and because they are beautiful. You lie back. The ground is cool. The stars seem almost impossibly bright. You begin to wonder how many people looked at this same sky. A farmer. A child. A king. A servant. A sailor. A priest. A worker. A woman carrying water. A man returning from the fields. All beneath the same stars. The sky creates equality in a strange way. The social hierarchy remains. The wealth remains. The obligations remain. But the stars are above everyone. The same moon rises over the palace and the village. The same dawn arrives for the wealthy and the poor. The same river moves past both. That does not erase inequality, but it gives history another scale. Human institutions can appear enormous. The sky makes them small. A kingdom may last centuries. A dynasty may seem eternal. The stars make both feel temporary. And perhaps that is why the night is such a fitting place to think about ancient history. During the day, the world is practical. Work. Food. Water. Heat. Movement. At night, the mind can become larger. The river becomes a symbol. The stars become memory. The darkness becomes space for reflection. You do not need to know exactly what an ancient Egyptian thought while looking upward. We should not invent private thoughts. But we can acknowledge the obvious. They saw the sky. They saw its cycles. They saw its lights. They lived beneath it. And they gave those lights meaning. The stars remain. The people who named them are gone. The sky continues. A final worker returns through the darkening street. The day's work is finished. The pace is slower now. There is no reason to hurry. The house is ahead. A familiar doorway. A familiar wall. A familiar path. This is the moment the whole day has been moving toward. Not the monument. Not the temple. Not the palace. Home. The worker enters. The outside world becomes quieter. Someone offers food. Someone asks a question. Perhaps a child is still awake. Perhaps not. The household gathers. For a short while, the world outside does not matter. No king needs to be discussed. No distant province needs attention. No monument needs admiration. There is only the household. The body begins to relax. The shoulders drop. The hands become still. The day's heat remains in the skin. The dust remains on the feet. But the work is finished. This is the ancient equivalent of closing the office door. The difference is that the office and the home may be much closer together. The work may have been physical. The exhaustion is physical. And the reward is physical too. Food. Water. Rest. Companionship. Sleep. These are simple things. But simple things are enough. You sit against the wall. The room is dim. The family speaks softly. The sound of conversation becomes part of the evening atmosphere. You do not understand every word. You do not need to. The tone is enough. People are together. That is what matters. A child laughs. Someone tells the child to be quiet. The laughter returns more softly. A vessel moves. A door closes. Then the room settles. You realize that you have stopped thinking about the modern world. For a few minutes, there is no need. No distant city. No screen. No traffic. No notifications. No calendar. No messages. Only the ancient room. The river beyond the wall. The stars overhead. And the quiet breathing of people who have finished another day. If an ancient Egyptian could somehow enter your world for one day, the surprise would not only go in one direction. You would be astonished by ancient Egypt, but they would be astonished by you. Imagine bringing an ancient Egyptian into a modern kitchen. Water comes from the wall. Light appears without flame. Food remains cold inside a box. Heat appears instantly. A machine washes clothing. Another machine grinds food. Another machine heats it. The ancient visitor might not understand any of it. But perhaps the strangest thing would be the amount of waiting you have eliminated. You do not wait for daylight. You do not wait for the river. You do not wait for a boat. You do not wait for a messenger. You do not wait for a fire to become ready. You do not wait for grain to be ground by hand. You do not wait for darkness to determine when work must stop. You have built a civilization around removing friction. Ancient people built one around managing friction. Neither approach is inherently more human. They are simply different. Your world is faster. Their world is slower. Your world is more mechanically complex. Their world is more physically immediate. Your world hides production. Their world exposed it. Your food appears packaged. Their food appeared as ingredients and labor. Your clothes appear finished. Their clothes could reveal the work of spinning and weaving. Your water appears instantly. Their water had weight. Your night is illuminated. Their night was dark. Your information is endless. Their information was scarce. And yet, beneath all these differences, the same needs remain. Food, water, shelter, rest, family, security, meaning, companionship, hope. The ancient Egyptian would recognize you eventually, not your technology. You. The tired person, the hungry person, the person who wants to sit down, the person who wants a safe home, the person who wants tomorrow to be manageable. That is the bridge between centuries. Technology changes. The human body remains. The body still becomes tired. The mind still needs rest. The evening still feels different from the morning. The comfort of home still matters. And the night still arrives. The house is almost completely dark. The family has gone quiet. The final light has disappeared. You can no longer see the details of the room. Only shapes. The doorway. The wall. A vessel. Perhaps the faint outline of a sleeping person. Outside, the Nile continues. This is the strange thing about history. We often imagine the past as enormous. Empires. Armies. Pyramids. Temples. Dynasties. But most people experienced history from inside rooms like this. A small room. A large world outside. And the person inside could not possibly see all of it. They knew their neighborhood, their family, their work, their river, their gods, their local officials, their village. They may have known the name of the king, but the king was distant. The pyramid was distant. The great political events were distant. The immediate world was close. This is true even today. You may know that enormous events are happening somewhere, but your immediate experience is still your room, your meal, your family, your work, your street, your weather, your body. Human beings live at two scales. The world we know intellectually can be enormous. The world we experience physically is small. Ancient Egyptians were no different. A king could rule a vast territory, but the king still slept somewhere. A scribe could administer complex resources, but the scribe still needed dinner. A priest could serve a great temple, but the priest still became tired. A farmer could feed thousands indirectly, but the farmer still returned home. The enormous and the ordinary existed together. That is what makes history feel real. You do not need to choose between them. The pyramid and the kitchen belong to the same civilization. The temple and the workshop belong to the same city. The king and the farmer belong to the same river valley. The monument and the sleeping child belong to the same night. The Nile does not remember, at least not in the human sense. It does not know the names of the people who lived beside it. It does not know which pharaoh built which temple. It does not know which worker carried which stone. It does not remember the child who watched boats from the bank. It simply moves, year after year, generation after generation. The river is indifferent to fame. That makes it strangely comforting. History remembers selectively. People remember selectively. Monuments remember selectively. The river does not care. It flows past everything. The village, the temple, the field, the palace, the burial ground, the boat, the house, the abandoned settlement, the rebuilt settlement, the forgotten settlement. The river continues. And perhaps this is why standing beside it at night feels different from reading about Egypt in a book. A book gives you names. The river gives you scale. You realize how long the civilization lasted. How many generations lived here? How many people watched this same water? How many children became adults beside it? How many workers returned home beside it? How many families disappeared without leaving names? How many people died and were buried? How many rulers came and went? The river saw all of it. And yet, nothing about its movement announces that history has happened. The water simply moves. There is a lesson in that. Human beings build monuments because we fear disappearance. We carve names into stone. We paint tombs. We write records. We preserve objects. We tell stories. We want the future to know that we existed. Ancient Egyptians were no different. Their civilization invested enormous effort and memory. But the ordinary people who lived beneath the monuments did not need eternity every day. They needed dinner. They needed water. They needed shelter. They needed family. They needed sleep. And tomorrow they needed to wake up. The river flows. The night deepens. The village sleeps. There is a point in the night when even the last household sounds begin to disappear. The voices stop. The footsteps stop. The tools are still. The fires become embers. The boats are quiet. The animals settle. Only the sounds that cannot be stopped remain. Water. Wind. Insects. Breathing. The ancient settlement enters its deepest quiet. This is perhaps the moment when you finally understand what darkness means. Darkness is not simply the absence of light. It changes behavior. People stay closer to home. Movement becomes more deliberate. The world becomes smaller. A lamp becomes valuable. A doorway becomes difficult to see. The sky becomes enormous. And the mind becomes aware of sounds that would disappear during the day. A distant footstep seems closer. A small animal becomes noticeable. The river seems louder. The wind moves across the roof. The silence between sounds becomes part of the soundscape. You do not need to fear it. There is no dramatic danger approaching. Nothing needs to happen. The night is simply continuing. That is enough. You lie still. The wall beside you is warm. The air moves. The stars remain above the roof. The Nile continues its slow journey. And for a while, ancient Egypt stops being a historical subject. It becomes an environment. You do not need to think about dynasties. You do not need to remember dates. You do not need to remember names. You can simply listen. Water. Wind. Silence. Breath. Water. Wind. Silence. Breath. The rhythm becomes gentle. The civilization is still there, but you are no longer walking through it. You are resting inside it. Perhaps the title has been unfair. Perhaps, after all, you could last a day. You would struggle. Certainly. You would complain. Probably. You would miss your conveniences. Almost immediately. You would wonder where the cold water was. You would want a comfortable bed. You would want an easier way to move around. You would wonder why everything takes so much effort. But by the evening, something might surprise you. You would have learned. Not much. Just enough. You would know where the shade is. You would know where the water is. You would know which path leads home. You would know when the heat is strongest. You would know when the river becomes beautiful in the evening. You would know where the family sits. You would know when the lamps are lit. And perhaps that would be enough to make the world feel slightly less foreign. This is how humans turn strange places into homes. Not by mastering everything, by learning a few things. The first day teaches survival. The second teaches routine. The third teaches familiarity. After that, the strange becomes ordinary. Ancient Egyptians had generations to learn. They inherited knowledge from parents and grandparents. They added their own experience. They made mistakes. They adjusted. They passed things onward. That is why you cannot compare yourself directly to them. You are not weaker. You are simply untrained in their world. Put an ancient Egyptian into your modern city, and the same thing would happen. The traffic would be overwhelming. The machines would be confusing. The electrical systems would be mysterious. The endless information would be exhausting. The buildings would be strange. The social rules would be unfamiliar. They would struggle too. Civilization is a collection of learned habits. We rarely notice our own because we learn them as children. You know how to behave in an elevator, how to use a supermarket, how to cross a road, how to open a refrigerator, how to use a toilet, how to operate a computer, how to order food, how to read a clock, how to communicate instantly. These things feel natural. They are not natural. They are learned. Ancient Egyptians had their own learned world. And once you understand that, the distance between us becomes smaller. We are not fundamentally different people. We are people trained by different environments. That may be the deepest answer to the title. You would not last a day in ancient Egypt because you were not raised there. Not because ancient Egypt was impossible. Because every home has a language of habits. And you do not know the language yet. The night is almost over. You do not see the first light yet, but it is coming. The darkness is beginning to change, very slowly. The stars remain. Then the horizon becomes slightly less black. A faint gray appears. The river becomes visible again. The roofs emerge from darkness. The trees become silhouettes. The settlement begins to return. A bird calls. Then another. Someone wakes. A door opens. A vessel moves. The ancient day is beginning again. And this is where we can finally understand something about endurance. The people of ancient Egypt did not survive because every day was easy. They survived because life is repetitive. A difficult day is followed by another day. A tiring season is followed by another season. A poor harvest is followed by another attempt. A broken tool is repaired. A damaged house is rebuilt. A child becomes an adult. An old person dies. A new generation begins. The civilization continues through repetition. Not every day needs to be extraordinary. Most days simply need to happen. And that may be true of our own lives as well. We often imagine endurance as something dramatic. A person facing an enormous crisis. A heroic decision. A moment of courage. But most endurance is quieter. Getting up. Doing the work. Preparing food. Caring for someone. Repairing something. Trying again. Going home. Sleeping. Beginning again. Ancient Egypt was sustained by millions of such ordinary acts. The pyramids were built once, but meals were prepared every day. The temples were expanded over generations, but floors were cleaned every day. The state recorded enormous quantities of information, but individual scribes still had to write each line. The Nile supported agriculture for centuries, but farmers still had to work each field. History becomes possible through repetition. The sun rises, the river flows, the people wake, and the world begins again. Before we leave, take one final walk through the settlement. The light is soft. The streets are still mostly quiet. A few people are beginning their routines. You pass the house where you slept. The wall is familiar now. Yesterday, it was strange. Today, it is recognizable. That small change is everything. You pass a vessel. Yesterday, you barely noticed it. Today, you know what it means. Water. You pass a tool. Yesterday, it looked primitive. Today, you understand the skill behind it. You pass the river. Yesterday, it seemed like scenery. Today, you understand that it is the reason the settlement exists. You pass the fields. Yesterday, they were simply green. Today, you see food. You pass the temple. Yesterday, it was a monument. Today, you see an institution maintained by people. You pass the workshop. Yesterday, you heard noise. Today, you hear craftsmanship. You pass a child. Yesterday, the child was simply a child. Today, you understand that this person belongs to this world in a way you never could after one day. The child knows the river. The child knows the streets. The child knows the household. The child knows the language. The child knows the gods. The child knows the seasons. The child knows what is normal. And that is perhaps the most important difference. Normal is powerful. What seems extraordinary to an outsider becomes invisible to the person who grows up with it. The heat becomes normal. The darkness becomes normal. The labor becomes normal. The river becomes normal. The mud brick becomes normal. The absence of electricity becomes normal because electricity never existed in the first place. No one feels deprived of something they have never expected. That does not mean people never wanted more. Of course they did. Humans have always wanted more. More food. More comfort. More wealth. More security. More status. More beauty. More time. Ancient Egyptians were human, but expectations are shaped by the world. And that is why modern people can find ancient life so difficult to imagine. We carry modern expectations into an ancient environment. The ancient Egyptian did not. They carried ancient expectations. That is the difference. The sun appears. Not dramatically. There is no need for a golden cinematic explosion. The horizon simply becomes brighter. The river catches a thin line of light. The rooftops warm. The first shadows stretch across the ground. The world is visible again. You watch the settlement wake. It looks almost exactly as it did yesterday. And perhaps that is comforting. The world is still here. The river. The houses. The fields. The temple. The boats. The people. Nothing needs to be explained. The day has begun. You think about how much happened in one ordinary cycle. Heat. Water. Work. Food. Craft. Family. Religion. Trade. Rest. Darkness. Sleep. And yet, from the perspective of history, almost none of it would have been considered important. No battle occurred. No king died. No dynasty began. No monument was completed. No famous speech was given. It was simply another day. But for the people who lived it, that day was their life. That is the strange mathematics of history. The events that seem insignificant to us were enormous to the people experiencing them. A meal mattered. A child's illness mattered. A successful harvest mattered. A broken tool mattered. A marriage mattered. A missing worker mattered. A boat arriving mattered. A good evening mattered. A safe return home mattered. The scale of history is not the same as the scale of life. And perhaps that is why ordinary history deserves more attention. Because most human beings have always lived ordinary lives. The famous are the exception. The ordinary are the rule. Ancient Egypt was not populated primarily by pharaohs. It was populated by people. And those people were busy. They were making their lives work. The people are gone. The settlement changes. Walls collapse. Houses are abandoned. Objects disappear beneath dust. The river shifts. Generations pass. The names of ordinary people fade. And yet, things remain. A bowl. A comb. A sandal. A piece of cloth. A writing fragment. A tool. A bead. A child's object. A cooking vessel. A work record. A piece of wood. A little scrap of everyday life. Archaeology begins with fragments, not complete lives. Fragments. And from fragments, historians try to reconstruct patterns. We have to be careful. A single object cannot tell us everything. A single tomb cannot represent an entire society. A single text cannot describe every person. A surviving artifact is evidence, not a complete photograph. This is why uncertainty matters. There are things we know, things we can reasonably infer, things scholars debate, and things we simply do not know. The honest historian leaves room for all four. That does not make history less fascinating. It makes it more fascinating, because the gaps invite questions. Who held this object? Why was it placed here? What was this room used for? Why was this person absent from work? Who wrote this letter? Who repaired this tool? Who walked this path? We may never know. But the question itself brings us closer to the past. You pick up a small object in your imagination. It is ordinary. No gold. No royal name. No grand inscription. Just something useful. Something someone touched. Perhaps every day. And now, thousands of years later, you are thinking about it. That is a strange form of survival. The person disappeared. The object remained. The object becomes a memory. And memory becomes history. If there is one thing you should carry away from this journey, it may be this. Ancient life was expensive in human effort. Not necessarily expensive in money. In effort. Water cost effort. Food cost effort. Clothing cost effort. Transportation cost effort. Construction cost effort. Light cost effort. Communication cost effort. Warmth cost effort. Cooling yourself cost effort. Keeping things working cost effort. And because effort was visible, people developed strong relationships with time and materials. You could not waste everything. You could not assume replacement was immediate. You could not assume that another object would appear tomorrow. You repaired. You reused. You stored. You planned. You remembered. The household became an organization. The village became an organization. The state became an organization. Civilization itself became a way of coordinating human effort. That is what makes the pyramids so extraordinary. Not simply their size, their coordination. Stone had to be extracted, moved, shaped, placed. Workers had to be fed. Supplies had to be organized. Information had to travel. Tools had to be maintained. The project had to continue. The monument is a physical record of organization. But remember the smaller scale. A family preparing dinner is also an organization. Someone collects fuel. Someone prepares ingredients. Someone cooks. Someone serves. Someone cleans. Someone stores what remains. The scale is smaller. The principle is the same. Human beings coordinate. They divide tasks. They depend upon one another. And from that dependence, civilization emerges. There is a final reason ancient Egypt remains so compelling. The environment is still recognizable. The Nile still exists. The sun still rises. The desert still surrounds the valley. The sky still darkens. The river still reflects the light. The landscape has changed enormously. Modern Egypt is not ancient Egypt. Cities have grown. Technology has transformed life. Agriculture has changed. The river is managed differently. Modern society is vastly different. But the physical presence of the Nile creates continuity. You can still stand beside the river. You can still watch sunlight move across the water. You can still see the contrast between cultivated land and desert. You can still understand why a civilization would grow here. Geography survives longer than political systems. Kings disappear. Languages change. Buildings collapse. Borders move. But rivers remain. Mountains remain. Deserts remain. And when we stand beside those landscapes, history becomes physical. The past stops being only a date. It becomes a place. That is what we have been doing tonight. Not memorizing ancient Egypt. Visiting it. Quietly. Without crowds. Without heat becoming unbearable. Without needing to carry the water yourself. You have been allowed to look. To listen. To imagine. To understand. And now, slowly, we can leave.